These monsters focused on mankind. They destroyed all living things. The monsters devastated, eliminated, and carved up the whole world. Because they came from dark, desolate lands, people gripped by fear called them terrible demons. Alan Scollin said that he entered the night school and graduated, staying in first place until the very end. Later, Keith Brandon's skills were appreciated, and he became the youngest person in history to achieve sage status, and then he was placed in the Order of Knights. Alan asked the guy how come he was demoted after less than a year. But taking all his will in a fist, Hiroto decided that he must stay at the event and get a rank on the exam, because this way he will be able to get the opportunity to officially work in the World Organization of Non-Standards. Alan smiled and said that he had really done a good job for the year anyway, but he had assumed that the problem would form sooner. Alan told the lad that he would take care of the order issue. Keith Brandon mumbled that if the leader of the order continued like this, it would get worse. Suddenly someone called the guy's name. A man with a mustache named Count Venux Baru ran into the room. He yelled at Keith for daring to disobey his plan. The guy stood bewildered. Keith explained to the man that since the situation on the battlefield had changed, he had to act quickly. The Count yelled that he was tired of hearing such excuses from him, and could no longer get away with repeated arbitrary behavior and abuse of his authority. Keith snorted and said that there were no casualties in that situation anyway, and the demons had been eliminated. The Count was not happy with the guy's behavior. The man shouted that it wasn't just about the result. His actions are a serious offense, undermining the discipline of their knights. Besides his familiarity, he is the current head of the Baru family, having achieved great success in the previous war between humans and demons. Keith said that since he was talking about such things, he should also watch his mouth. Besides, it was the previous Count, Eric Baru, who was successful in the previous war, not him. The man became enraged and reached for his sword. The Count swung his sword at the guy, wanting to kill him, for he was very angry. Keith was surprised at the man's behavior. Keith deftly dodged the Count's sword. The guy swung at the confused man and mumbled that if he had enough strength to overpower him, it would be much less troublesome for the others. Keith struck the man, and he fell to the floor, the people around him dumbfounded by the situation. Alan said with a broad smile that nevertheless there were those who raised a hand to an aristocrat in his 20s. Keith did not react in any way to the blond boy's words. Keith asked Alan if it was true that nothing could be changed, because as long as that person was in command, it could cause harm. Alan answered that in the current situation it is not difficult, because the House of Lords has a strong influence on the staff of the Knights. He can't do anything about it from any angle, but he would really like to solve this issue. Keith asked the lad why the demotion was possible. He thought he would be sent off to war again. Alan replied that in truth there was a message from the House of Lords. The boy and girl were surprised that the boy couldn't control his spiritual power. Kid was surprised and asked if it caused him any hardship. Alan smiled and said he didn't care. After all, he was the cause of the problem. Alan told the lad that originally the 11th Order had a low ranking. The people who were causing the problems were high up in the order, setting a bad example. Keith asked if that was the case what he should do better. Alan replied that maybe he should go back to the life of an explorer. Alan turned his back on the lad and said that he knew his abilities perfectly well, so putting Keith in the front line would not have the desired result. Alan said that the current order could not bring back his hometown, that it was in the sphere of demonic influence. Keith replied that it was just like that. Alan thought about it and asked if there wasn't a way to change the radical point of view. Keith had no idea what those clever words meant. Alan said the truth was that Selena had wanted to get him a long time ago. Keith asked if he was talking about Sel's sister. Keith remembered a nuance about Selena's sister and asked Alan about it. He said that was correct. Alan explained to Keith that Celine is now the director of the Royal Knights Academy, and he wishes for Keith to start educating future knights as a teacher. Keith was shocked at such an offer. He began to recoil, saying that his relationship with magic is rather peculiar. Alan replied that he knew that. Alan replied that anyhow, the matter had been resolved, and from next month Keith would start teaching at the same hour. The boy shouted that next month was the day after tomorrow. Keith clenched his fists and grumbled that Alan is an evil prince. The guy replied that it was nothing. Keith asked if he was correct that he didn't have the option to say no. Alan replied that it's just their alma mater after all. The man said that's not what he's talking about. 2 days passed. All is quiet within the walls of the academy. The students stroll around during recess. Keith came to the Royal Knight Academy. It is an institution where knights are trained to fight demons. In this place for the elite that is located in the capital, it is much harder to study than a simple academy. Looking at the academy building, Keith felt a strong sense of nostalgia. When Keith graduated from this academy, he was 13 years old. Since he was a genius, he jumped through the grades. Keith decided that he would go to Selena's sister's house to start with. When the guy arrived at that girl's house, she was insanely happy to see him, because she didn't think he was coming at all. Selena is the principal of the Royal Knight Academy. She is the oldest friend of Keith and Alan. Also, she has the title of Sage. Selena said that seeing him even reminded her of her school days. Keith said that the girl hasn't changed at all. Selena suggested that the guy should get down to the main business, and said that he will be working at the academy as a teacher. Keith replied that was right. She explained to the guy that he would be assigned Class 1A. Those students had just entered and were still very young, so it wouldn't be hard for him. Selena explained that he would be giving lectures on his specialty, and she had also made his schedule so that he wouldn't have a heavy workload and would have plenty of free time, and he would be able to spend it on personal research. Keith noted that she had done a good job of preparing. Keith said that it was great that he would be able to do research, but was everything in order? The girl replied that she believed that his research on increasing the survival rate of knights would be beneficial. Celine told him that they would prepare the lab, but if anything was missing he could safely ask. She would try to prepare whatever she could get at the limit of her powers. Keith smiled and thanked Selena for her help. The girl reminded him that he wasn't allowed to call her sister Sel. She was the principal, and he was a teacher. Selena said that as long as it was just the two of them it was fine. However, in public they should speak as teacher and principal. Keith realized that even as a high school student, it would have been weird to call Sel's sister until she was in her 20s. Celine suggested moving on to the next case. She suggested moving on to Prince Alan's message, which was called keeping it a secret that he was a wise man. The message said that it would be a shame if it was found out that the sage had been demoted. Celine laughed and said that was totally Alan's style, and then told the guy that he had never been too popular, and it was unlikely that anyone would recognize him as a sage. She then said it would be good for him to refer to the documents to get the information he needed about the curriculum. And that was it for now. Selena asked if he had any questions. Keith said he only had one question, why she wanted him to become a teacher. The girl looked at him seriously and asked if he knew about the prejudice against the death of knights. Keith replied that during the 3 years of war among the knights, it was mostly young soldiers who died. Selena said that's right. Although many trained recruits are sent from each knight academy every year, they are treated as easily replaceable. Especially the low-rank order. If it goes on like this, the more clueless the captain is, the more people will die. Keith immediately thought of Benoit being such an example. Selena said that in the world fighting demons is considered a competition. She thinks the situation is worse now. Keith said he agreed. Even though it is considered a competition, Humanity's right to live is diminishing every year, but on the other hand, not everyone can come back. Selena said that although it's sad, it's true, and in this situation it only pushes back the collapse of the country. Keith asked the girl if he needs to toughen up the students. He and Prince Alan have worked very hard with this problem, however that is the limit. That's right, the graduation rate of the Royal Knight Academy's graduates had definitely improved because Sister Cell became the principal. However, as a result of the training period of the knight recruits being shortened, there were only more deaths among them. Alan was also surreptitiously acting in different directions. It would probably take some time before they would get a noticeable result. However, the demons wouldn't wait. Selena cried and started begging Kit to save the students. She just couldn't stand seeing reports of graduates brutally killed in the war anymore. Keith noticed that even for Selena's sister it was too brutal. Keith closed his eyes and clenched his fists. Keith clenched his fists and told the girl that he has no experience at all in raising others, and he doesn't know if he can raise them properly, so he can't promise to save her. However, the place he is aiming for hasn't changed at all since that day, and it's a place he can't get to on his own, which is why he will try his best to be a good teacher to achieve his goal. Covered in tears, Selene thanked the guy. She suddenly started running towards the guy to hug him tightly. Keith yelled for her to stop, because no matter how much she did, it was not worth wasting the powers of higher magic for nothing in such quantities. The girl hugged the guy and mumbled that either way, she was insanely happy. The guy exhaled and said that was fine. As Keith walked through the academy, he heard the students talking. They were discussing that their new teacher had been expelled from the order. The students doubted that it would be okay. Keith thought about the fact that they could have spoken a little more softly about him. The clock in the boy's hand jingled, and Keith mumbled that he had to go. Keith walked into the office, where his students were already waiting for him. They all looked at the guy suspiciously. The guy introduced himself to his students and explained that he was their supervisor from today. For some reason, he was delayed, but now they could ask him questions. Nosferatu were one of the few non-humans that recognized human society. It was a very powerful being that had lived for thousands of years and possessed strength comparable to a class of vicious demons. Graham asked Keith if it was true that he was kicked out of the order, and now he was working as a teacher. Keith was surprised at the guy's courage. He wasn't afraid of him and assumed that this student was just stupidly honest. Sister Sophia was a fighter with the highest rank in the World Organization of Non-Standards, and also had the ability of perception. This person was loved by everyone. Keith then asked the student if he was satisfied with this answer. Graham was very embarrassed and replied that it was fine. Keith realized that it was business as usual. The fact that knights could be kicked out of the order was not known to humans at all. It was of course hidden from civilians. Keith thought that in principle it did not need to be hidden. After a couple of moments, other students wanted to ask questions, and the guy could not refuse to answer. Aristella stood up from her desk. This student's magical attributes were wind and water. She is the fourth daughter of the ducal house and is an excellent student. She has the best score in the entrance exam. This girl was the only one who at the time of admission was able to work with two attributes at once. The girl said that she entered this academy to become a better knight. She in no way thought that she would be trained by a knight who was expelled from the order, and asked Kit if she could become a great knight. Kit replied that it was up to her to decide. Aristella asked what he meant by that. The guy leaned on the table and said that if their grades change from the teacher's qualifications, it means that they were like that from the beginning. He said that luckily if they got into this academy, it would give them knowledge not in a limited amount. There were many documents to look through. The students here were given the best conditions to study and train. Keith swept up. This is for those who really want to study in this academy. Aristella shouted that he was an irresponsible person who was giving the wrong arguments. Keith exhaled and replied that if she didn't like his classes, she could choose not to attend. He would count it as attendance, and he would eventually give her credit without a problem. Aristella pounded her hands on the table and shouted that this was not the case at all. She asked the boy if by such behavior he was not admitting his helplessness and making the students work. The other students watched with keen interest the conflict between teacher and student. Keith then asked her if she wanted praise, if because of her helplessness he should treat her especially. Aristella replied that she did not quite mean that, but that his version was also suitable. Keith understood that she was snapping at him because of the pride she had inherited from her father, for she was the fourth daughter of a ducal house, and she wanted to become the head of the best and most famous First Order of Knights. He had no idea that things were so messed up here. However, it intrigued him greatly. He knew very well that Aristella was inferior in strength to Selena and Alan when they were at the academy, but he didn't consider it a problem. Keith was madly wondering if Aristella's will to become the best knight was really that strong. Keith said that there was some truth in what she said, and truth be told, he thought so too. The students continued to watch the conflict. It made Keith angry every time he saw a weak person with power in front of him. After all, he always wanted to gag such vile people. Aristella looked at the boy with eyes full of hatred. The bell rang in the academy. Keith said that although they had not finished their discussion, today's class hour was over. He told the guys that they would have hands-on training afterward. He suggested that the guys change the content of their course a bit today. Aristella didn't like his suggestion. Keith explained that apparently there were some who were treating their abilities with their sleeves, so he would give them an impromptu battle. One of the students shouted that they wouldn't beat the former knight's teacher. Keith smiled and said that they would have a head start. They could attack him in 10. The students decided that this was a real mockery. Aristella got up from her desk again and said that usually the freshmen of this academy are usually grouped in threes, and this way they could even overpower an average ranked knight. Keith replied that numerical advantage was the perfect condition for this kind of magical combat, and Aristella shouted that in that case they couldn't lose. Keith asked why don't they just try to have such a practice. Before leaving the office, Keith said that they should change their clothes and gather at the training ground. When Keith left the office, Aristella yelled that he was just messing with them. The students gathered at the training ground. Keith was pleased that the students had come. A girl named Fairy suddenly ran up to him and asked why he hadn't changed his uniform. Keith immediately remembered that she was from a commoner and her exam scores were low. Fairy said that their uniforms were very comfortable and extremely high-tech. Kit said that she shouldn't pay attention to that, but she shouted so much that it couldn't be ignored. Elliot capriciously stated that there were so many exceptional newcomers this year that it was very tiring. The guys from the Magic Power Department had already finished their work and went out to have fun, which made the girl envious. Aristella walked over to the rest of the students and yelled for them to gather in a pile. Keith said most likely they hate him. Fairy asked the boy if there was any reason why people might hate him. Keith asked the girl if she should go pack up too, because Aristella is really angry right now. Fairy ran to the students. Keith realized that as expected in this class, there was no disagreement between the commoners and the nobles, and it was Aristella who was responsible for the situation. The boy decided that even though it was a bit rude, he should observe the students, because he could not understand everything just from the papers. Guy watched the boys and girls warm up for the upcoming battle. Then they joined the ranks in front of the teacher. Keith decided to start with precautions. Even though this is a simulated battle, most of the physical damage is replaced by magical damage. In other words, they don't have to worry about getting hurt. However, if they take damage, they will faint. The rest of the lessons won't have it, so they shouldn't overdo it. A guy named Bellamy whose magic attribute is Earth. He was born in a family of nobles. His entrance exam results were high. He asked Kit if it was true that he was their only opponent. The guy replied that if they underestimated him, it was completely their problem. Keith motioned for the guys to finally start the fight. At the same instant, the students activated their magic. Each of the students tried their best in order to defeat the teacher. However, Keith destroyed absolutely every shield that the students made in an instant. In the first second, the boys didn't even realize what had happened. Keith said that he just tried to do it, having seen it once, and that a long time ago, but still like Sister Cell, he couldn't do it. The students started to get indignant, saying that someone who was expelled from the order after serving part of a year couldn't use space magic. Aristella shouted to all the students to shut their mouths so there would be no noise. She shouted to the boys that right now they were in the middle of a battle. They should only think about the enemy and stay alert. Keith stood and looked at the students. He asked in surprise if they wanted to finish him off with one blow, and Aristella said they did not. Keith explained that on the battlefield dirty tricks are natural, because it is not always possible to carry out a fight strictly according to the plan. At Suzu's request, the dwarf heated the blade after the strike and then quickly cooled it down. Keith suddenly clenched his fist, and at that moment, Aristella's body turned to stone. She immediately felt like she couldn't move or even speak. Aristella realized that the teacher had taken control of her body. The dwarf understood and smiled approvingly. He had no idea where the boy had learned such a thing, but it sounded pretty interesting. The students were badly frightened and didn't know what to do. One of the disciples shouted that such a situation could never happen to knights. Keith replied that it was definitely mean. However, on the field with demons, it was a common situation, and would they really tell the demons the same thing? The student didn't know what else to say, and mumbled that of course the teacher was right. Keith told the boys to imagine that this was a real battle. He was the demon who had captured their precious comrade, and asked them how they would act. The guy asked if they would save themselves, preparing to suffer greatly, or for the sake of protecting others, attack the demon holding their comrade captive. All the students looked at the teacher in bewilderment. She said that if she were faced with such a choice, she would prefer death. Keith looked at the girl in surprise. Suddenly, a sphere of amplification appeared around the girl. Suddenly, a reinforcement sphere appeared around Aristella, which radiated inconceivable power. The other students looked at their comrade with pride. Keith was surprised by such magical power. He assumed that in order to achieve such a result, Aristella had combined water and wind magic. There is a limit to the magical power that people can handle at one time. Keith realized that Aristella had clearly removed this limiter set up for her own protection. Aristella jumped out of the teacher's confinement and immediately began reciting a new spell. Keith saw the magical storm that Aristella had made, and remarked that it was even more terrifying than before. Suddenly Aristella lost her guard and started listening to what the students were saying. Some said she was very cool, and some thought her actions were over the top. Aristella thought that this was her most powerful attack, and it hit the target, but from the reactions of the people around her, it was not clear if it had done any damage to Kit. Suddenly the teacher was in front of her, unharmed. Kit walked towards the students with a faint smile on her face. The students were dumbfounded that the teacher wasn't even hurt. Keith said that he didn't think an immobilized hostage was capable of such a thing, and that's why he feared foul play in a real battle. One of the students asked in surprise why he was unharmed if they had seen the spell hit him. Keith laughed that they were expecting him to answer. Keith replied that understanding the enemy's abilities was one of the basics of battle, and if they understood why he survived that attack, they could win. Suddenly, Aristella grabbed the kunai. She launched 3 kunai at the teacher. Keith was surprised by this decision, however, he was ready who were ready for anything. The secretary stated that this year's pledges are really amazing. Marion killed 9 lower-class demons completely invisible. Mizuho showed that she could control 2 attributes at the same time. This was the next promising generation that the whole world is watching. The boys and girls were showing really outstanding abilities despite their young age. Heisei, who was standing nearby, said that Hirota was next in line. She was really curious to see what the guy would show them that was so unusual. Aristella shouted that they would have a chance to win if they attacked all together, and those who are good at close combat should bear their weapons and go to the vanguard. Aristella ordered all those in the rearguard to attack periodically and try not to hit their allies. Keith believed that a warlord was called someone who was able to concentrate on what was important. The boy took a big step forward towards the students. He said that the battle would only begin now. Already at that moment, the disciples with weapons were waiting for him at the vanguard. They were determined to win. Keith looked at them and noticed that sometimes they gave good attacks. Suddenly, the guy noticed that there was no Aristella among the students. This made him very tense. He quickly deflected the attacks of his neighbors and looked back. Behind his back, Aristella was reading a spell. The guy realized that Aristella was combining magic again. She would release excess magical power, and logically that could lead to very bad consequences. Keith decided that she needed to be stopped immediately. Keith found himself behind the girl, and grabbing her mumbled that he couldn't ignore this any longer. The students started yelling that their Aristella had won. They began to run at the teacher, screaming that they were ready to avenge Aristella. Standing on the battlefield was Hirota, surrounded by 5 dead ghost bodies. There was a large column of dust in the air. The students surrounded the teacher, trying to attack. Keith began to taunt the boys and ask if they were already exhausted. However, the boys shouted back that they weren't done yet. Meanwhile, Aristella was in the medical room. Opening her eyes, the girl realized she was in the medical room. The nurse asked if she was awake. Akris is the doctor in charge of the medical room. She is an excellent mage healer. Akris walked over to Aristella and took her temperature. She explained to the student that she had fallen during a practice fight, but there should be no problem using the excess magic. Aristella remembered the moment when the teacher, who was supposed to be standing surrounded by students, just seemed to disappear. Suddenly, the girl was interrupted by a phone call. She was notified that she was receiving a call about the murder of Sophia's sister. The girl assumed that he combined wind magic and body enhancement, but even taking those 2 types, it was clear that Kit was using much more magic. Aristella thought that even at such a high level, fighting 30 freshmen at the same time was too much. Keith couldn't get out of Aristella's thoughts. Akris asked the girl if she wanted to hear the results of the battle, and she said she didn't want to, because they couldn't handle such an opponent at the moment. Akris mumbled that she would quote the teacher's words anyway. It turned out that Keith had said of Aristella that she was indeed promising. Aristella couldn't believe that Keith had said those words about her. Akris mumbled that once she opened her eyes, she accepted reality for what it was. Aristella thought for a moment and asked Akris if it was true that she knew Kit's teacher well. Akris lied that she had met him recently, but in fact she had been at the same academy with him a year below her. Aristella asked thoughtfully who Keith's teacher was. Akris replied that she didn't know that, and asked if he had surprised her that much. Aristella replied that it was crazy. With sadness in her voice, the girl said that just yesterday she thought she could surpass her father, whom she thought was the strongest. Akris reflected on the fact that Aristella's father had faithfully served as captain in the strongest and most famous First Order, and to claim that there was someone who surpassed such a man in ability was astounding. Keith reflected on the fact that he had greatly overdone it on his first day of work, and assumed he had a cold. Acres told the girl that she was excessively lucky. After all, she would be learning and training every day from such a strong man. On the walls hung a variety of staffs of different shapes and sizes, and the girl asked what type of staff he preferred. After that question, Acres asked the girl to listen to her. Acres pounded the table and said that excessive modesty is ruinous, for everyone respects effort and despises laziness. Aristella clenched her fist and mumbled that this was her chance to become stronger. Acres looked at the girl with a smile and realized that she really was just as Keith had described. The girl imagined such a staff and said she didn't have one. Not only would it be useless because it couldn't hurt the enemy, but it would only be 20 centimeters in size. Aristella tried to get out of bed and asked how the others were doing, but suddenly she felt a strange feeling. She suddenly fell backwards. Luckily there stood Acres, who caught her by the shoulders. Acres explained to the girl that it was too early for her to move, as she might show symptoms of magical exhaustion, so she should rest for a while. Aristella replied that she understood, and would do what she needed to do, because there was no need to hurry. Meanwhile, in the headquarters of the Knight's Order, Count Venua was indignant. The man pounded on the table with his hands and shouted why Kip Brandon had such a light punishment. He was dissatisfied that he was simply expelled from the order. He was answered that although he belonged to the 11th Order, but strictly speaking, he was not being treated as his subordinate. Many other subordinates at the cabinet table said that Keith is a wise man, and the king decides how to treat a wise man, as long as he has connections with Prince Alan, who is in charge of most of the affairs. Even if it was possible to expel him from the order, no big punishment can be given. Count Venua hit the table so hard that the ink fell and spilled over the table. He clenched his fists and said that Keith was a real scoundrel, because he made a mess of his order whenever he wanted. The man began to run down the corridor and shouted that because of him his subordinates no longer respected him. Meanwhile, Keith did not stop sneezing, because Count Venix remembered him. Keith was giving another lesson to his students. He told them that even if they became knights now, they would all be dead within a year. The students looked at the teacher in surprise. A student named Emile asked if the teacher was exaggerating about death, and added that no one thought to compare to him. Elia stated that although the guy has A-level spiritual power, he can't use it, so it remains useless. Meanwhile, the girl was resting in the medical room. The students agreed that Aristella was indeed the strongest. Keith said that even for that 3 years before graduation, one must work hard, study, and train to gain the power to defeat demons. Keith then reminded them that if they didn't want his classes, they could choose not to come. However, if they showed results, he wouldn't deny their train of thought either. Fairy raised her hand and asked what if his classes were the only thing they would miss. Keith replied that wasn't what he was talking about right now, and looked at the girl with dark hair. Her name was Lena Lindbull. He asked her if it was true that her family had been great scouts for generations. The girl said he was right. The students wondered how he knew what was going on at Lena's house. Keith went on to say that scouting is a role that requires special skill and magic even from a knight, and even if in this case Lena wants to excel in scouting, wouldn't it be more effective to study the same program as everyone else? Keith asked the students. Lena asked if he meant that it was worth putting in more effort to achieve his goal, and he replied that it was. Keith confessed to the students that he was not going to evaluate their efforts. He would evaluate what magic they use and how strong they become. Besides, effort is needed to make up for a lack of ability, not to hide or conceal it. Although Lewis was grateful to the wound for his words, But still he realized that everything would not be so easy. The guy asked the students to identify their strengths and weaknesses, and he would show some techniques that would help them strengthen the strong ones and overcome the weak ones. A girl named Sarika said that he was just assigned today, which means he doesn't know much about them. Keith replied that he was aware of all their academic performance over the last month, so there was no problem. In their training battle, their strength was proof of that. Many students thought that Keith was actually not a bad person. Keith decided to talk about the results of the training battle. Aristella apologized for sleeping in the medical office for the rest of the school day. The girl looked thoughtfully away. She decided that she had to meet him first. She was upset, however, because she did not see the teacher's name on the lesson table. The girl remembered that the teacher named Mary said that such a time Keith should be in the office, but he was not in the staff room. Aristella assumed that they just missed each other. Suddenly, admiring exclamations of women were heard in the crowd. Mizuho and Marion turned around as well. The girl gave a startled cry and turned around. The teacher asked her if she was really that scared. Aristella was ashamed that she had cried out in fear, but she quipped that anyone would be scared if someone called out from behind their back. Keith told her that the doctor had said she was not well, but he could see now that she was fine. Aristella replied that everything was fine and apologized for causing trouble. Keith then asked if that was all she wanted to ask him. Aristella replied that she would also like to talk to him if he had time. Keith replied that she was hard enough and told her to follow him to his office. The teacher and student walked alone down the long hallway. As they walked down the hallway, Aristella asked where his office was. She asked where his office was because she couldn't find it on the index board. Keith replied that it had just been transferred, so it hadn't been added to the board yet. Lewis found out that the girl had indeed passed out due to the poison on the arrow. In addition, there was a curse involved. Aristella was surprised that he used the magic password for the office. When they got inside, Keith apologized for the mess. He then told her not to touch anything in the study, or there would be an explosion. These words scared Aristella badly. Aristella scrutinized the items that stood in the study. Keith pointed to a couch and told her to sit down there. Aristella did so. Keith sat down across from her and asked her what she had come to him with. Aristella anxiously said that she wanted to apologize for what had happened this morning. She explained that because of the rumors that he had been kicked out of the order after a year of service, she was sure it was because he hadn't tried hard enough as a knight. However, so the strength he had demonstrated in the training battle could not be gained through his sleeves. Keith looked at his apprentice in surprise. Aristella added that she had criticized him out of her prejudice. Making a small bow, Aristella apologized to Keith again. Keith was silent, which frightened Aristella. Then he said this and asked her to raise her head. She asked in surprise where his reaction was. Keith with a smile asked if she thought he would scold her. Aristella said she expected it. Keith answered her that he wasn't as limited as she thought he was. Then he suddenly remembered about her combining the two magics and said he had something to say about it. He said that her Alberize spell is a magic that is clearly too powerful for her. If she keeps using it like that, one day she won't be able to handle the recoil. And added that he didn't know why she was carrying on like this. However, if she was thinking of future plans, she should refrain. Aristella looked at the teacher attentively. Keith then said that if she wanted to use such magic, she should start by increasing the efficiency of the technique, magical transformation, and added that, of course, with the base load, magical abilities would also increase. Aristella said that he is indeed fickle. Though he said not to use this magic, he said that in some situations it seems acceptable. Kit replied that it is only her decision to make. The teacher said that only she alone would be responsible for her decision. Aristella felt some kind of enlightenment after saying that. From the forest thicket appeared a huge clawed paw, which easily crushed one of the wolves. Aristella explained that he was a knight and became a teacher, and asked if he was happy with that outcome. In the end, Suzu came across this creature, the same iron lizard that Dove Ragsen had mentioned. Then Aristella asked that since he liked being a knight so much, surely he could take care of him. Keith was surprised at such a question. Keith realized that Aristella was anxious about whether or not she could be a good knight. However, why would she be in a hurry when she could use bi-compound magic? Why would she be so worried being talented? Keith nodded his head and began to answer the question. Keith flagged that he doesn't think zeal is that important. He is of the opinion that it doesn't matter if the zeal is there or not. If there is a result, then good. The teacher explained that he works with the intention of achieving excellent results in his role as a teacher so that the students grow as strong knights. Aristella asked him if his words could be trusted. Kit replied that it was up to her to decide for herself. Walking up to the office door, Aristella apologized. Aristella walked out of the teacher's office and pensively walked down the long hallway. The announcement of the results of the ranking examination was completed. Heisey once again congratulated all the examinees on their admission. The students listened attentively to the teacher. Keith was pleasantly surprised that all the students came to class. He expected some to take a break, but they didn't fool themselves. One of the students asked Keith what page to open the textbook on, and Keith replied that they wouldn't be using textbooks in this class, so they didn't have to carry them. Fairy asked frustratedly if there was something wrong with their textbooks. Keith replied that there was. He explained that the textbook doesn't include the latest research and some of the information in there is outdated, but of course, that's not considered a great problem. It's just that he figured he would teach them everything about magic from scratch. Some of the students were happy about it, and some frowned at the teacher. The students were whispering about the teacher being a little more confident than before, and the explanation was that he was very cool at magic. A little earlier, Keith asked Selena if it was okay to not use the textbook. She replied that the textbook was indeed outdated. Then the guy asked if she was okay with him teaching the kids his own way, since his magical theory was unique. Celine replied that he had become a sage by developing a number of new theories through his own research. He needed to be confident. Keith was pleased that he had gotten a good thing from Selena's sister. The teacher told the students that they would start by looking at the basics of magic. He began to explain that when they use magic, they use the so-called magic power. It is in the air and can accumulate in a person through the senses. According to recent discoveries, what is hovering in the air is called magic element. It is clearly different from the magical power of the body. Aristella asked the teacher how the magic element differs from the magic power. It was discovered that magic elements in their original state could not be converted into magic with techniques. In the past, there had been research on using a huge device to use higher magic. The reason for the discontinuation was that the magic elements in the air could not be converted into magic in any way. Another student asked, "What about magic tools?" Keith replied that it was a mechanism where the magic power of the user responds to the technique engraved on the tool. In addition, magic tools don't require much magic. Still, these things are for everyday use, so there is no need to gather a magic element out of thin air from the beginning. Keith then said that magic elements automatically turn into magic power the moment they take them into their bodies, so they don't need to worry about it. Keith exhaled heavily and said that they could now move on to magic transformation. The teacher said that in truth, when transforming magic elements into power, not all become the same type. Power can be divided into several types depending on the origin. They correspond to the conventional attributes of wind, fire, water, and earth magic. It is believed that those attributes that you know how to use will change depending on how well you wield them. A student exclaimed that this was the first time he had heard such a thing. Keith replied that this was why they were learning this material. He went on to say that the type of magical power is determined by which senses magic is used with, and it's also often hereditary. And sometimes the whole family uses the same attributes. The school day was coming to an end. The tired students thought that the teacher's pace was too fast. Heisei ordered Mizuho and Marion to take Hiroto and leave the place immediately. The teacher said that he was starting the class, but first of all he wanted to discuss something with them. He wanted to know what goal the students were aiming for. He first asked Raoul, who answered without a doubt that he wanted to be the best knight. Keith said that everyone sitting here has vague goals, but in the end, the final goal is something that is within reach. A student asked if he meant 100 points on a test. Keith said yes, their personal goal is important. He then asked if they knew about the tournament on campus next month. Aristella said it is an annual competition that all grades from 1st through 3rd year participate in. Keith said it is natural that every year the 3rd year students come out the winners. It is usually at the tournament that the 1st years learn the difference in strength firsthand. So they should set a goal for the whole class. The students marveled at the teacher's idea. On his day off, Keith came to the teacher's office. He smugly informed the girl that he knew exactly where she was aiming. Gaston grabbed Heisei's wrist. Suddenly a man named Balak, a former squadron commander of the 3rd Night Order, appeared in the office. He asked the boy if he had come to work on his first day off. Keith told him that the transfer to the school had been sudden. However, he wouldn't say he had found it difficult. Balak replied that it was actually wonderful that the teachers coming in lately were so blazing with enthusiasm. The teachers at the academy he had attended back in the day had been solidly all indifferent, just people who were going to, but never became members of the knightly order. Keith remembered that when he had studied it had been like that. Balak exclaimed that the young teachers could be trusted. Keith realized that the order that is now in the school was created thanks to the efforts of Sister Selena. The boy told the man that he knew him to be an attentive teacher, and the students were said to be active in his lessons. Kit wondered what subject he taught, for the students call him Demon and are wary of him, but he had heard that there were none who disliked him. The man was pleased to hear that. He then asked Kit what had happened to his students, for he had seen them in yesterday's class. Keith asked if his students had done something wrong. Balak replied that the opposite was true. He thought they all seemed to have changed for the better, and then said that they had always been excellent students. Just now, with more enthusiasm or motivation, rather it felt like they were filled with rage, which was a surprise. Keith was pleasantly surprised. The guy explained that essentially nothing much had happened. He had just set a goal for the whole class and then asked if he was teaching a strategy course. Balak said yes. Keith suggested that they had a strategy after they identified the overall goal. The girl took his herb and agreed with him. Keith replied that their common goal was to win the tournament next month. It was already the 5th day after leaving the city. Suzu walked along the mountain path along the forest and occasionally looked at the radar. Keith explained that in the past there have been those who have achieved a similar result, and it is normal. Balak replied that he was right. The man said with a smile that the Class 3S would win either way. Keith then asked if he was talking about Luca Rivet. The man got embarrassed because Keith just got here, but already knows everything. He explained that in his opinion Luca Rivet is a genius, and the other students in this class are great kids. Luca Rivet is the head of Class 3S. She is known to everyone for her outstanding abilities on the battlefield. Keith remembered that she fought in a training battle with an active knight. Balak added that the result of the battle was a draw, but from start to finish Rivet fought for supremacy. With her understanding of tactics and good judgment, she is perfect for the role of commander. Keith realized something. Keith realized that if Class 1 aimed to win, then without a doubt the biggest obstacle would be the 3rd C class with Luca Rivet at the helm. Keith said that Luca Rivet definitely shows himself as a true knight. However, he believed that for the students after his training, there would be no opponent that could not be defeated. In the office, Keith was sitting at his desk. Akris walked into the office. She smiled. The doctor apologized to Keith for the intrusion. Lewis knew that there would be a big commotion if anyone found out that the rookie adventurer possessed high-level magic, so he made the decision to hold back and only use basic weak spells. Keith began to get angry. His eyes were blank. The hero replied to Akris that he was, for a second, well into his 20s. The doctor replied that she knew that. Akris said that even though she'd been working here for 4 years, he was still the oldest to her. Keith was uncomfortable. He asked what she meant by that. The girl was embarrassed. She replied that it was nothing. Akris said that after all, he hadn't changed at all. She started laughing. Keith said that she was being rude as always. The hero continued that, by the way, she's been calmer. She's even picked herself up since then. Akris asked that his heart beat more often at her mature charm. The hero replied that such words were more suited to Sister Cell. Akris rolled her eyes. Keith said that, well, there it was again, as soon as Selena's name was mentioned. Akris replied that what was there to take from him. She smiled. Keith asked her what business she was here on. He explained that unfortunately it wasn't that he was free. Akris replied that he really hadn't changed in that habit of his. She said to herself under her breath that one would have thought he was a workaholic. The girl's face changed. Akris continued that it wasn't that it was an outright thing, but she was a little worried about one student. Keith asked what she had said about Aristella. Akris asked how he understood it. Keith explained that it was because they hadn't dealt with anyone else for work that week. He continued that, besides, someone like her wouldn't have missed the potential threat in a person. Akris asked why on earth she was in such a hurry. The girl was serious. Keith crossed his arms over his chest. He apologized for not knowing such details. The hero said that she had calmed down a bit now, after all. He continued that though, it was more like she was trying to show that there was no need to rush. Akris suggested that something had happened in her family. Keith said he had tried to find out all he could about it. The girl raised her head and looked at him. The hero pulled out a pile of papers. He began to read the information about the student. Keith said that Aristella was the youngest child in the Granleys family. She had 3 brothers and 3 sisters. The hero went on to say that they all seemed to have excelled while under the leadership of their father Edmund in the First Order of Knights. Akris asked that, in other words, people who were successful, when their surroundings expected something from them, it became a burden. Keith hesitated for a moment. He replied that, in principle, such a thing was possible, yes. Akris looked at him with a questioning look. She said it looked as if he had found something. Keith answered in the affirmative. Keith said that was just his first impression of Aristella. He continued that she looked like she was scared of something. Akris asked that since he said that, it could have been that she was scared. Keith replied that it was because death was scary. Akris interrogated him. The girl was surprised. Keith continued that, therefore, assuming that it was so. He paused in his speech. Keith said that that family, and indeed the men of the Granleys family, were telling the truth to their faces. He blew out a breath. Akris asked that even if it was an insult, there was nothing that could be done about it. Keith replied that it was true. Keith continued that if Aristella was afraid of losing the battle, then he had to deal with it right now. Akris smiled again. Keith started to get worried. He asked if he had said something wrong. The girl replied in the negative. She added that he did think highly of Aristella. But the man quickly and deftly dodged it. He considered it rude, for in his opinion he had done nothing wrong. Acres knew that it mattered to him if someone was talented, what their abilities were, and what they were good at. She thought back to the past. The girl thought that Aristella was of no value now, but her potential and capabilities inspired confidence. Acres speculated that perhaps it would be important to Keith someday. The girl told Keith that it looked like Aristella was destined to become an important person. Acres said she was a little jealous. She was still in Keith's office. The girl yelled that it was a joke. She started to smile. Acres explained that she too wanted to be so important to someone. The girl muttered to herself that that was exactly what she was trying to say. Keith hesitated for a moment. He asked Acres why she said that now. The girl was starting to get nervous. Keith told Acres that she was important to him too. At this point, Marion took out a small vial of holy water and asked her to banish the evil. Keith asked what doubt was on her face. The girl blushed even more. The hero crossed his arms over his chest. He went on to say that he should have said that even if the people were nice, he wouldn't waste his time on them. The man grabbed the girl by the throat and said that he likes more reserved girls and Marion is just another feisty girl. Keith said that then, if their students needed help at the health center next week, she should have taken good care of them. The hero called Acres a doctor. The girl replied that it would be just as her senior would say. Fort Klingsor, west of Magnolia Territory, southwest of the capital. Someone slammed the table. He shouted, wondering how many more times he had to keep saying that. The man yelled that the 11th Order needed soldiers and supplies for the next big operation. He was very angry. His interlocutor replied that with all due respect. The interlocutor paused in his speech. His interlocutor was Franz Magnolia, the second son of the Magnolia Lords, in charge of the Klingsor Foundation. He told the man that as he already knew, the fight against the demons was in a state of variable success. Franz continued that under such extraordinary circumstances, he could find no rational reason to carry out the operation within the time frame. The man got angrier. He shouted, asking what he had said. Franz continued that, in addition, for several days now the defeats had continued. He added that there were also many wounded people here. Franz said that knights like them were also carrying out risky operations in bad conditions. He added that, to be honest, it was simply reckless. His interlocutor was furious. He interrogated him. The interlocutor shouted, asking that he dared to mock him. Franz shouted that they were obligated to fight demons no matter what. Franz asked that, or was he okay with the country being destroyed? The interlocutor realized that he was in a quandary. The interlocutor replied that although they were cooperating, the relationship between lords and members was supposed to be equal. He continued that this was why he could not agree with his point of view. Franz's face changed. He said that it was the unified opinion of the Magnolia family. The interlocutor wanted to object, but Franz didn't let him continue. Franz said that he was now going to give an objective reason. Franz said that over the past year the military situation has stabilized and the front line has become more distinct. He continued that if this situation were similar to what had happened in the past, then yes, it would be worth considering a strategy to regain the right to exist, which they had decided to do as a result of the reverse offensive. Franz added that, however, in the current situation it was impossible to carry out this operation. Franz asked the interlocutor that he thought that this reason was known to him as well. The interlocutor became angry. He asked if he could ask Franz to remove himself. Franz replied that right now they needed to help the wounded. Franz said one last thing, if Keith were here? He stopped. Franz removed himself. The man was furious. There was a heavy downpour outside. The carriage was waiting for Franz. The man was yelling in his office. He yelled at how annoying he was. The man asked himself who this Franz thought he was. He shouted he was the head of the glorious Barovinua family. Venus was sitting in a carriage with servants. He was silent, but he was very angry. The man thought that if those who disrespected him cited military successes, it would be admirable. He realized that if it were the result of his practice, they would have no choice but to acknowledge him. Venus thought he would have done it. He told himself that if his father could do it, he could do it. Outside, the rain did not stop. A young man who was with Franz asked him that Mr. Keith, previously mentioned in the conversation, was that wise man. Franz answered in the affirmative. He added that Keith was a distinguished member of the order. The young man was silent. The young man said that he had heard from the House of Lords that he had been expelled from the order, but without details. The young man clenched his hand into a fist. He said he could imagine. The young man fell silent. He was interrupted by Franz. He said that what they could do after he left was to protect this place a little more from demon encroachment. They reached the doorway. Franz ordered a report on the condition of the wounded. The young man obeyed. Keith told the students that it was time for the practice battle. He continued that, as was the case last week, it was getting harder to cooperate with their comrades because of the larger number of people involved. Hero said that, so today's practice they had a practice battle of 3. Hideo realized that now he had a great chance to show his skills to Mizuho, but he knew that if he did, he could be killed. Keith looked at the piece of paper. He was going to say something else. The students were gathering into teams, trying to make friends and get to know each other. Keith thought it was great that everyone was separated. He was still looking at that piece of paper. Someone called out to him. The student yelled that whatever he said, and here the balance of power was just awful. Keith asked Raul what it was that made him unhappy with Aristella and Emile. He said that they were the top 3 after all. Raul continued that it was the opposite. The apprentice explained that he wanted to say that together they were too strong. Keith replied that that was how it was. He said that it seemed to him that the apprentice was very confident. The hero continued that since that was the way things were, he wasn't going to interfere. He added that they had to kindly show the result of that confidence of theirs. Keith told the team, who had been deemed weak during warm-ups, to approach him. Raul asked what he was even thinking. Sarika asked, from whatever angle you looked at it, wasn't their team awful? She said that she, Fairy, and Lena were the dregs of the class. Fairy said that Sarika was very cruel. Lena stood nonchalantly. Keith said that there really was such a thing. Sarika interrogated him. The girl asked that the 2 of them had the element of fire. Maybe they should have switched her and Raul to get balance. Fairy shouted, asking that she wanted to leave. Fairy said that she couldn't use the other 4 elements to good effect. Sarika asked her if she could even use magic. Fairy yelled that how could they say that? The girl explained that though they could use body strengthening and healing magic, but since it was in battle. She added that if she had to choose, it was water. Her friends looked at her. Sarika asked what if she had to choose. Fairy asked Lena that although she had heard that she had a family of scouts, she really was strong in tracking and such. Lena answered in the affirmative. She clarified that they were strong in tracking and controlling the 5 senses. Sarika asked that the same was suitable for combat. Lena said she would do what she could. Fairy said that enthusiasm was the only thing that held up. Keith said they were supposed to be the first to fight in today's practice battle. He added that their opponents were supposed to be Team Aristella. The girls were scared. Sarika screamed, asking why exactly their opponent was so strong. She asked the teacher that he had a grudge against them. Keith answered in the negative. Keith explained that he thought their victory could overturn the hardened perceptions of that class of panic. Sarika's team was alarmed. Sarika asked the teacher what he'd said about the classroom theory. Keith said that it didn't have to be that way. He continued that no matter how strong they were, it was the right thing for beginners. Keith told the girls that they were able to get into the Royal Academy of Knights after all. He added that they had the lowest ability level. Keith smiled. He said that since it was like that, depending on what method of battle they were going to use, they should have had a good chance of winning. Lena replied that they were all really bad at fighting. Sarika shouted that that was exactly what it was. She continued that they had to look at them, the losers of the class. Sarika had low magic power. Lena had a weak magic output. Fairy had almost no striking power. She also had poor sword skills. Keith said that it wasn't surprising that they believed that. The hero continued that it was true that Aristella's team had superior magic powers and action quotient. They also controlled their magic perfectly. He added that even in sword wielding too, everyone was a master. All of this really hurt the girls. Keith continued that in the end, even if they all attacked together, they probably wouldn't win. He was going to say something else. Keith added that they didn't need to compete with the enemy in an area where they had a clear advantage. The girls hesitated for a moment. Keith continued that they had to show the enemy their strengths. He added that, on the contrary, they themselves could fight by making the most of their local position. Fairy wanted to say something, but she was interrupted by Sarika. Sarika said that it was a way of fighting for weaklings. Keith said that their main goal was to last the round. Keith continued that they had to put a knowledgeable Lena in front of them to detect enemy attacks and dodge. The hero added that Fairy was to follow her with healing and body-strengthening magic, focusing on the group's survival. Keith went on to say that Sarika was supposed to disperse barrage fire magic from medium range. He said that she was supposed to hinder them in every way possible so that the opponents wouldn't be able to activate magic. Fairy asked if that was all it was. Keith answered in the affirmative. He said that, in any case, they shouldn't have been heroic, and they should have disrupted the enemy's plan and delayed the fight. Keith told them that if they hurried, it was likely that their opponent would also change the way they fought. He went on to say that the rearguard was worth focusing on either Fairy or Sarika and rushing in to attack with all their might. Sarika said that even if they could get up to those three, it wasn't a given that they could take it. Keith said that this moment would certainly give them that opportunity. He continued that, besides, since they realized when the opportunity would come, it wouldn't be that hard to realize it. The hero said that it was necessary to attack the opponents who weren't focused enough on Lin. He added that it was necessary to surround them and strike together. The girls became stunned. Lena asked that they could do it. Keith replied that it was up to them. The hero said that if they couldn't pull it off, he wouldn't have told them from the beginning. The girls perked up. The boy had eaten all he wanted that day. He laughed a lot, so the food tasted much better in good company. Fairy said that the opposing team seemed to be done with strategy. Emile said that even if they could do it, the power differential was ruining it. Raoul said that there was definitely a catch. The countdown was on. At the same time, on the other side of the door, the other bandits were still unaware of anything. Keith asked himself what could have come of it. Keith said that from here, the first round of the simulated battle was to begin. He added that the one who incapacitated the enemy or made them fall down was the winner. The girls' team was determined. Team Aristella prepared for battle. The opponents looked at each other. Keith shouted that the fight was on. The opponents started yelling. Aristella watched the opponents. The teacher asked what they understood. He added that all the basic information for the trio was realized like this. He wrote on the board. The teacher said that in this formation, while the vanguard was stalling, the rearguard was using powerful magic. He continued that similar types of battles were used in operations with a central attacker who protected the rearguard and supported the vanguard. Aristella listened intently. Aristella thought that the opponents had the same information, but they didn't have a strong mage. She thought then that they could win if Raoul's magic was used in this battle. They had one. Sarika used the fire shot spell and pointed it at Raoul. Raoul asked what the obstacle was. Aristella watched them. Aristella thought she had gotten Sarika. Lena popped up in front of her. Aristella asked what it was. She was dumbfounded. Lena was serious. Aristella wondered where Lena was from here. She didn't expect something like this. Emil apologized to Aristella. He said that Lena was quicker than he thought. Aristella said she was fine. Aristella suggested to Emil that the two of them would crush Lena first. Fairy stood behind her. They attacked each other and dodged their opponents' blows. Lena was serious. Emil was attacking Lena. The girl realized that he was stronger, but she didn't want to give up. Lena jumped back from her opponents. She started using magic. The opponent was about to be attacked again. Emil shouted, asking why Lena could see their attack so well. Keith was watching them. Apparently they didn't need any help, and in that case, the hero decided to check her status. Suzu placed the girl on the ground and applied the evaluation skill. Graham said that was too weird. Keith agreed with him. But the guy himself was more surprised that her status was different from others. Keith replied that it was, however, because physical strength was being improved by fairies strengthening magic. He added that there was nothing wrong with that. Graham shouted that he had said that even if it was, Lena wasn't capable of reaching that level of technique. Keith explained that it was due to the magic of detecting and amplifying the five senses, which Lena was already an expert in. He added that it was something she usually did by anticipating the enemy's actions. Graham interrogated him. Aristella asked herself if it was right or left, which side to approach from. Lena thought they were going to attack from the right. Lena fended off Emil's blow. Keith said that to pull it off she should have had the physical training, which she didn't. He added that even looking ahead wouldn't have helped her. The elven girl came to her senses and looked at the guy in surprise. She asked who he was, and said she felt amazing magical power from him. Suzu introduced himself by his name and asked if she was all right. He explained that she had been kidnapped earlier. Keith had said that her job was to learn body-strengthening magic and increase the power of the magic output. He added that was all it took to change. Graham said that was cool. Keith continued that, however, Lena was a person who specialized in survival, so she didn't have the strength to defeat the two of them right now. Graham asked what it meant that Team Aristella had to win in the end. Keith replied that he hadn't said that at all. Keith said that firing on Sarika would have exhausted Raoul without doing much damage. Graham said that was true, after all. Graham continued that Raoul should have, like Sarika, used his light magic. He added that Raoul couldn't even counterattack. Keith agreed with him. Keith said that Raoul seemed to be good at quick magic. Graham replied that there was no point in using powerful magic then. The hero assumed that she was able to escape alone, but the girl replied that she had no magic power, so that wasn't true. Sarika continued to attack Raoul. She was using the same fire shot spell. Raoul was annoyed. He only had time to dodge. Raoul flew into the wall from behind. Sarika was overjoyed. She continued to attack him. Keith said that, in fact, even among the monsters, there were those who provoked others. He continued that in such a situation, a knight who could only handle magic that took time to activate risked becoming ballast when faced with a demon. Keith continued that a knight that could use magic suitable for fast shots, but with low damage like Serica's, could handle slow demons. He added that on the battlefield, this often played an important role in preventing demon invasion. The interlocutors continued to watch the battle. Keith said that depending on the battle situation and the way of fighting, the abilities needed varied. Aristella suggested leaving Lena behind. She said her speed was troublesome, but if they were careful, they could manage. The girl said that she and Emil would go to Serica, and Raoul was to cover. The boys obeyed. Keith said that was right. He continued that no matter how powerful a force he had, if he couldn't use it faithfully in battle, he would be useless. Raoul thought that he might be able to hold Lena off. Serica's team cheered. Serica shouted that the demon was here. She jumped back. Aristella asked herself that they had switched positions. Aristella said that since that was the case, it was necessary to capture Serica. Emil agreed. Serica thought they were advancing. Fairy was using body-strengthening magic. Lena was going to attack Raoul. Raoul was annoyed. The three girls were going to attack the opponents together. Each of them took on one opponent. Graham shouted that their best attack was completely repelled. Keith was overjoyed. Fairy was the last to attack. Aristella and Emil didn't expect this. Fairy attacked. Raoul looked at his companions. Keith said that apparently everything had already been decided. Aristella was angry. The girls did not move from their positions. Aristella and Emil collapsed to the ground. The winning team looked at them. Raoul was puzzled. Raoul dropped his sword. He said he was surrendering. Everyone watching was surprised. Keith said that was great. He told the winning team to get those who were still unconscious to the medical room. Keith announced that the next match was to start right away. He told the teams to get ready. The team carried the students who were unconscious to the medical room. Acris yelled at Keith. She was angry. Acris said that no matter which way you looked at it, it was already too much. Keith sat in the med room. Acris yelled, asking how this happened and why. She yelled that 10 people were brought into the medical room at once. Gaston realized that even if one spoke vaguely, the words would have a clear meaning to the person who guessed what they were talking about. That was why one could act as if one knew everything, while only basing it on the scraps of memories one could see. Acris said that it was unimaginable that first years were brought to the medical office right after practice. She continued that because of that, there were no beds available here now. The doctor asked Keith if he understood that. Keith remembered that she used to grumble like that during his school days as well. A student's voice was heard. The doctor and teacher heard it and turned around. Aristella woke up. She thought she was in the med room. Acris told Aristella that she was awake. The student looked at them. Keith said that with it being her first fight, she recovered quickly. Acris walked over and put her palm on Aristella's forehead. She said that the apprentice didn't have a fever. Keith asked Aristella how it felt to lose to the 3 worst of the class. The student was upset. She asked Keith that he had no sense of tact at all. Acris thought she understood that feeling very well. She asked the student mentally to say it again. Keith continued that since they had chosen the most wrong way to fight, he asked that it was because she was the one who strategized and gave the instructions for the battle. Keith explained that if that was the case, she should have realized that most of the responsibility for the defeat lay with her. Aristella tried to say something, but Acris interrupted her. She told the whale to take it easy. The whale replied to her that it was none of her business. The girl got angry. Kit said that it wasn't that he was angry in the first place. Mizuho stated that although the guy seemed unreliable on the outside, he was actually very strong. Aristella thought that he didn't seem angry. She said that she understood the reason for their defeat. Keith replied that she needed to tell her that. Aristella said that she had strategized on the theory she'd gotten from Bollock's teacher's lessons. She continued that she had been wrong all along. The girl was sad. Aristella continued that this academy only taught strategy when fighting demons, but no one taught them how to fight demons. Accomplice and Keith looked at her. Aristella started to cry. Keith said that was right. He explained that by using the wrong tactics, she herself was far from defeating her opponents. Keith asked what, then, she thought they should have done to avoid defeat. Aristella wondered. She replied that they didn't need Raoul's powerful magic to begin with to defeat those who were no stronger than the lower demons. The apprentice continued that if Raoul stood in front of her, and she took a rearguard position and bombarded the opponents with magic, then perhaps. Aristella paused. Keith replied that that was exactly what it was. He said that there was no point in speculating that they had failed because they had done as they had been taught. The hero continued that, then, of course, they had made the right decision on their own. He added that the training itself hadn't always been helpful. Keith asked her that she'd been wary, after all, when he'd advised Team Fairy on a plan of action. Aristella replied in the affirmative. She said that's why she put herself in the middle position. Keith said that, in principle, it was the right thing to do, but in general, it may well have been the best way to get their guard back up. Aristella looked at him with a questioning look. She asked what he meant. Keith replied that she had been worried about the plan and had begun to fret, so she had latched on to the theory in a panic. Keith added that this weakness in her heart was the main reason for the defeat this time. Aristella remained silent. Aristella said that she was proud of herself at that moment. She added that with the same information, at their limits, they could have won. Keith said that in reality, her strategy, which was formed for a specific purpose, without using enough force didn't work in the end. Accomplice thought how shameless he was. She pulled herself back that though it was fair. Aristella had said that she was the reason their team lost. Aristella said that she understood. The student continued that, so next time she would remember the incident and take it into account when strategizing. Keith replied that admitting defeat led to growth. He said that people learned from mistakes and grew stronger. Aristella's eyes began to sparkle. Accomplice said that was right. She added that someone like her could definitely win next time. Kit asked Accomplice not to spoil her. The doctor said that she had her own ways of inspiring. Aristella smiled. She replied that that was how it was. Accomplice blushed. Keith was unfazed. Keith said that as it wasn't that human versus human fighting skill was important in fighting demons, and the grades at the Night Academy weren't worth much attention. He continued that since it wouldn't be useful to her in the future, it wasn't worth dwelling on. Aristella said that wasn't the way to do it. After all, they wanted to win the tournament that was supposed to be held next month. Accomplice questioned her. She shouted, asking that the first years wanted first place in the tournament. Keith thought it wasn't him who had said it. Accomplice said that she had never heard of anyone succeeding. Aristella replied that there was someone who had succeeded in the past. She added that, so they could do it too. Accomplice asked her if she would be able to convince the guys in the class. Aristella answered in the affirmative. Keith and Accomplice looked at her with incomprehension. Suddenly, Gaston felt a silhouette behind him. He turned around and screamed in horror. The first to support the goal set for the class was Aristella. The goal that flowed out of her words became the goal of the class. Keith thought he was right in that Aristella had leadership qualities. That was what worried him. Keith remembered Aristella's weakness that sometimes showed up. Keith sat in the classroom. Someone knocked on the door. It was Sariki's team. Fairy asked if he was okay with them interrupting him a little. Keith replied that, in principle, he didn't mind. The girl apologized for the intrusion. The girl sat down on the couch. Keith sat across from them. Keith said that since they had come here together, the conversation had to be about today's mock battle. He asked if there were any questions. The students looked over at each other. Sarika said she wanted to express her gratitude to him. Keith asked her again. Sarika replied that she thought so. Sarika said that she may have been discreet about it, but she had nevertheless worked very hard since she was a child to achieve her goal of entering the Royal Academy of Knights. She continued that when she got in, she ended up having a lot of amazing people around her, so she had been a little discouraged lately. The girl continued that that's why she couldn't even imagine that they could have won that training battle. Keith listened to her intently. Sarika continued that at first she couldn't even believe that they had won, but in that second she was so happy. The girl blushed. Sarika said that she couldn't even find the words, but she felt a sense of security. The girl continued that of course everything had worked out because of Fairy and Lena. She wanted to say something else. Sarika said that she thought that it was primarily thanks to the teacher. She thanked Keith again. Keith replied that that's how it was. He remained as unflappable as he was. But the guy decided that if she had that hairpin with her, she would be fine. What was more important was the other thing. Keith said that the truth was that they had done a good job today, and he wanted to congratulate them, but just one win wasn't enough for him. Lena asked that they needed to win next time, too. Keith replied in the affirmative. Keith continued that it didn't mean that they would get special treatment. He added that until they won, he wouldn't say anything. Keith said that his classmates have always worked hard together to win. He added that in general, if he left them alone, they would become strong without his supervision. Fairy asked, which sounded like he didn't want to strain himself. Keith looked at her seriously. Fairy was uncomfortable. Keith said that it sounded like she thought he was suggesting that they not strain themselves. He smirked. Fairy yelled that she hadn't said that. Lena and Sarika grinned. Fairy was a little embarrassed. Lena said that at first they thought he was a very scary man, but he surprised them a lot. The girl added that he laughed a lot, and he joked sometimes. Keith replied that, in principle, there was nothing unusual. Lena said that he gave a creepy impression. Fairy said that even if we talk about laughter, in his case, it was more like a smirk than a smile. There was some kind of ominous atmosphere, she added. Her friends called out to her. Fairy said she didn't say anything. Keith exhaled. Keith said that he was okay with them being happy about the victory, but they had to keep in mind that their abilities hadn't gotten any better. He continued that they would win the next time they changed tactics to suit them. The hero added that executing the plan as they were now was only a singular success. Sarika replied that of course they all realized that. She said that was why they had come here to talk. Someone called out to Keith. The students said that they wanted to get a lot stronger. Keith said that he was certainly pleased that they wanted to learn. He continued that he should have already told them about the academic study guide. Fairy said that was because everyone in the class was taught by him. The student was disturbed. She continued that because she was inferior to everyone, she wanted to become as strong as possible. Lena said she didn't want to be everyone's fifth wheel in the tournament. Keith crossed his arms over his chest. Keith said he didn't see the point in rushing now. He continued, 100 since they had worked so hard today, he would make an exception. Keith stood up. He said he was going to go and get permission and would be waiting for them at the range. The hero continued that he would give them a special briefing. The students cheered. Stone needles appeared around the girl. Suzu absolutely did not expect such a thing, but more importantly, judging from Suzu's radar, he didn't see any monsters nearby. Selina told Prince Alan that it was her. The prince told her to come in. Selina apologized for the intrusion. The prince told Selina that she had finally arrived. Gaston was in a huge castle, but the man did not know the place. Looking around, he made the assumption that it was a demon world. Suddenly something else caught his attention. Selina said that, for starters, she wanted to express her gratitude that the prince had dealt with Keith's incident. The prince replied that he thought that she was the one who could handle it. Selina asked if he was sure. The girl explained that she thought that those who had been to the front couldn't have a calm mind. The prince said that the order of knighthood didn't suit him. He continued that it was because he didn't trust people, he didn't know how to cooperate, and he didn't have the talent to lead. The prince added that he even punched the captain with all his might. He said he recognized his strategic management. Prince said that if it was a win here and now, through Keith's work, it could be achieved, but it would only be a one-time thing. He continued that no matter how much he achieved up front, it was meaningless if the losses spread in his absence. The prince said that the long-term strategy required the return of the demon-stolen place where the humans lived. He added that he wished Keith would try harder as a teacher. Selina said he had thought it through well. Prince replied that of course it was like that. He said that, above all, he was an excellent pitchman. Prince added that he understood why she wanted him specifically. Selina was uncomfortable. Selina said she just remembered that he had studied with Keith during his academy years. Prince offered to close the subject. Prince said that it was her fault for not being able to unlock Keith's talent, but it was necessary to improve the environment to do so. Prince continued that he saw that it wasn't enough. He added that that was why he relied on her. He called Selina the eldest. Selina asked Alan to listen to her. She asked that she really hadn't had a chance to do anything for Keith. Prince replied that he understood her, but Kit was still one of the few people he could trust. Prince said that he hadn't asked for much. He continued that it was enough to just discreetly help him with his teaching job. Selina replied that since that was the case, she would have done it without his instructions. She added that it was her responsibility as principal. Selina asked that there was any point in Keith hiding that he was a sage. The prince replied that he doubted it. He asked that if it had been known that he was a sage, would his students have listened to him? The prince said that, after all, it was boring. Selina remained silent. The prince answered his own question in the negative. He said that Keith didn't like being judged by rank. Selina asked that he said it was boring. Prince asked what she was talking about. Selina said that there was still no doubt that he, who recognized Kit more than anyone, would have gone for it. Prince replied that just to be clear, he only recognized Keith's talent. Alan continued, as for his character, he was a hopeless champion of the truth. Selina looked at the prince with a questioning look. Someone stepped on Fairy's arm. The girl cried out in pain. Sarika and Lena were worried. Fairy was lying on the ground. Her friend stood a little farther away. Her leg was still crushing her arm. Keith asked what was all that had already happened. Earlier, Keith had been practicing with the female students. Keith told the girls that he was now going to block Sarika and Lena's movements with magic. He added that they had to work together to get out of captivity. Sarika questioned him back. Hiroto was horrified. He lost the power of speech. The boy saw the bloody corpse of his beloved lying on the grass. Lena was in pain. Sarika was puzzled. Suddenly the boy heard the monster's voice. Meijin wondered why Hiroto was crying. After all, he himself had not finished off the villain last time. Sarika told Fairy to attack the teacher first and foremost. The girl fell silent. Fairy interrogated her. He said that a similar spell also sealed the voice. He told Fairy that she could do anything she wanted with them. She needed to consider that. Fairy was determined. She was using fortification magic. Keith said that she was going to go up against him alone. He added that last week she couldn't even think about that. Fairy replied that because now she could do it. The girl was going to get a sword. Keith said that there was such a thing. He continued that there wasn't that much difference between them and the rest of the class at all. Fairy was going to attack Keith. Keith added that even if that was the case, here it all amounted to complete recklessness. Hiroto no longer had a raison d'etre for existence. The boy was called out, and he looked up into the sky. Keith reflected the student's punch. Fairy flew off and fell to the ground. Sarika asked herself how on earth that happened. She thought he had just thrown a punch. Keith said he was just using her center of gravity. Fairy was in pain. Keith moved closer to her. He stepped on the student's arm. Keith said whatever was there, but her weaknesses were plentiful. Pulling away, Lieselot said with a gentle smile on her face that she and Hiroto's team would always look out for him. Keith pulled his foot away. Fairy tried to stand up. Keith asked, which was all it was already. Keith said that the only one who could move freely was defeated in such a shameful way. He continued that he wondered if they could buy time to escape. Fairy replied that Sarika had said that, hadn't she? She said that, plus, he couldn't use his hands. Keith asked that if he hadn't used his hands, they would have won. Fairy looked at him with a questioning look. Keith said that it was too naive to hope for that to begin with. He picked up the sword. Keith continued that it wasn't that his hands were busy. The girls were scared. Whale said that the grabbing was a normal action and generally didn't need support. Fairy asked why he was squeezing them then. Keith explained that if he had unclenched them, they would have made up for themselves. Kit told Fairy that she was always in a hurry to get somewhere. The girl stood up. She replied that it wasn't fair. Keith said that she should have told the demons that. He continued that she needed to develop mindfulness and come up with new ways to attack. Fairy began to rant at the teacher. She listed every insult she knew. Keith asked her if he had asked her to think up insults for him. Her friends didn't expect this. This tragic result happened because of the spiritual and magical power in his body. They were the spiritual power that people considered the second coming of the first head of the Damori house, and the magical power that Hiroto inherited from the only queen in the demon realm, that is, his mother. Keith asked the other students why don't they try other ways. He continued that during the last fight, Aristella was also tied up, but she somehow managed to free herself. The girls were screaming, but because of the spell, their voices couldn't be heard. Keith said he didn't hear anything. He added that he had sealed their voices, after all. The students were furious. Keith said that they themselves had asked him to teach them. He continued that he wasn't against them being assertive, but they needed to accept reality first. The girls were in the shower room. Sarika asked that no matter which way you looked at it, wasn't that cruel? She added that he was bullying and laughing at them, after all. Fairy said that she was the one who said he was dangerous. She insulted the teacher again. Sarika laughed. She replied that she understood why she had said that. She continued that she had, in fact, been forced to run the entire practice. Fairy yelled that it was hard. Lena said that the teacher was telling the truth. The girls were silent. They stood under the shower and washed themselves. Sarika said it was amazing that there were demons that could block movements without looking. She added that they were medium-sized. Lena asked what she had said about the ghostly palms. Sarika answered in the affirmative. Sarika said that she remembered quickly. Lena explained that it was a necessary skill for a scout. Fairy asked that wasn't that weird. Fairy said that they said that demons' unique abilities were different from magic. She asked if that was why humans couldn't use them. She continued, asking then wasn't it strange that teacher Keith was able to replicate the abilities of the ghostly palm. Serica said about that. The girl asked what kind of magic element the teacher had. Lena replied that it was probably still unknown. Serica said that, also, it was strange, firing such a strong knight. She asked why he was fired. Lena replied with a question that maybe he had hit the captain of the order. Serica laughed. She replied that there was no way that could have happened. Lena said that either was true. The girl continued that although the teacher was stubborn, he would never do such a thing. She added that they usually went to jail for something like that. Selena replied to the prince that she would tell Keith that as soon as she got back. Selena said that it was necessary to give Sage Brandon the imperial decree. Graham and Bellamy were talking in the corridor of the academy. Bellamy said that it was military operation number 1, so the battle order couldn't be changed so easily. Graham asked if the rules couldn't be deviated from on such occasions. Keith approached them. The interlocutors noticed him. The interlocutors asked the teacher to listen to them. Keith agreed. Keith replied that this was how it was. He said that the method for raising irregular troops into actual combat. Graham asked that even if the operation was different, it was better to react quickly according to the circumstances. Bellamy said that while that might be true, if the plan changed abruptly, the command would be in turmoil. Keith replied that there had been such a thing. Keith was a former knight who had been forced to change the operation plan by an incompetent commander. He crossed his arms over his chest. Keith continued that it was better for them to see and find out for themselves. Keith was in the classroom. He said that, in general, the academy had the battle records of the knightly orders. Keith continued that they should have asked Teacher Bollock when they had free time. He would show them. Raoul asked what was in those protocols. Keith said that was a good question. He explained that, first of all, they had only theory in their heads. They didn't see the real picture of the fight, and were prone to being stubborn, even arrogant. It was embarrassing for the students. Keith continued that what they were learning here was the basis, and you could say it was the ideal of the theory. He added that, in a way, the protocol of actual battle was unreliable information, that if wounded, blood and pus would come out. Keith continued that by combining multiple theories on the battlefield, a decision, sometimes departing from the theory, often resulted in victory. Graham asked that, in other words, he wanted to touch on the early perception stage of a real battle. Keith replied that he did not now. Aristella asked that battle with their defeat should have been recorded as well. Keith was silent. Keith answered in the affirmative. He said that the record of each knight's team's victory. He continued that, moreover, the extent of the damage was to be recorded in detail. The students began to whisper. Graham told Bellamy that of course they would go. In the principal's office, Keith apologized to Principal Celine. He said that she had called him out on it. Selena replied that was exactly what happened. Selena said that Prince Alan had given Sage Brandon an imperial decree. Keith repeated. He said that it turns out that he couldn't refuse. He added that although he had no reason to refuse him. Selena said that, as expected, they were getting along great. Keith explained that he and Alan had the same goal, but he could talk better than him. Selena laughed. Keith asked Selena what Alan had asked for. Selena began to read. She said that it had been reported that a pack of monsters had slipped through a gap on the northern front. The headmistress continued that although the monsters were heading straight south to the capital, the monsters could attack the city on the way, so she would like to ask him to intercept them before that could happen. Keith hesitated for a moment. He said that since the exemplary Third Knight Order was responsible for the northern front of the royal capital, he thought that it didn't happen often. Celine said that, for that matter, he resembled a wyvern, and it seems they weren't prepared for his appearance. A wyvern, a large B-class demon. A monster flying at tremendous speed, and with such hard armor, inexperienced knights wouldn't even be able to do damage. Powerful gusts of wind from its wings, fireballs flying out of its mouth. The tips of its claws and tail were poisonous, dissolving everything it touched. There was a high risk of attack. Keith thought that there could be problems with the speed of pursuit, plus, they couldn't throw over knights from the front capable of taking down the wyverns. At the moment, there were troops in the royal capital, but it would be difficult for them to fight off the wyverns. If demons like wyverns appeared there, the city might as well be destroyed. Keith said he understood. He added that he didn't think he would have had a problem with the wyverns. Selena thanked him. Selena asked if there was anything he wanted to do before they left. Keith answered in the negative. Selena took Keith's hand. They moved out of the study. There was a field all around. They looked around at the sides. Selena asked if he had seen them. Keith looked up at the sky. Keith looked up at the sky. He said there were 3 wyverns in the cloud on the other side. Keith continued that it would be hard to use magic effectively at that distance. Keith asked that he thought they were herded together, but there were only 3. Celine answered in the affirmative. She said there were 3 wyverns in the report. Keith thought they had bunched together. Selena suggested that they wait a while. Keith agreed. They looked up at the sky. Keith said he thought that would be enough. Selena said that if they had common sense, it would be too much. Keith stepped forward. He extended his arm forward. The hero said then he would begin. A magic circle appeared in front of Keith. Celine looked at it. The sad Elsa offered to tell the story from her lips. Even in a normal situation, using all 4 elements at once was very difficult. Keith could not only use high-level spells, but he could control magic that consisted of all 4 elements. Only Keith could use it. Keith used the Saddle Melic spell. Huge magic orbs flew at the demons. The spheres grabbed the wyverns. Celine thought the spheres were attracted to each other. At one point the spheres collapsed. Selena said that it worked perfectly. Keith said it was just that the wyverns were vulnerable to that magic. He went on to say that spells like that were used, but they were more effective. Keith said that, yes, and the demon didn't disappear immediately after its death. He added that he didn't know where they would fall and thought it was better to make them disappear. Selena said that he thought there were different types of magic power, and depending on the type, the magic he was good at and its type would change. She asked that depending on the type of magic used, the nature of the magical power in the body changed. Keith answered in the affirmative. He said that the age of rationality was a time when people who overcame a lot of conventions consciously controlled actions that they used to do unconsciously. Keith added that here was just the part about understanding the nature of magical power, and its action had not yet been fully explored. The sun peeked out of the clouds. They looked up into the sky. Celine said that, what were they doing standing around doing nothing? She suggested they go back home. Selena held out her hand. Keith agreed and held out his hand. They grabbed hands. In a moment, they moved back. The hero asked the girl to let him go. He was going to land on his own somehow. Ria agreed and immediately let Suzu go. In the library, Balak's teacher held out the protocols to Aristella. He said they were the first order battle records she wanted. Aristella thanked the teacher. The teacher told Aristella to tell him when she was going to return it. He was in the teacher's lounge. Aristella agreed to do so. The hero grouped up when he only had 1 second left. Despite the difficulty of the fall, he managed not to crash. Balaka said that he had already heard about the fight protocols. Keith replied that he thought so. Balaka said that Ms. Aristella had come by recently. Keith was surprised. Keith asked about the first squad minutes. Balaka replied in the affirmative. He continued that her father, Edmund, was the captain of the first squad. Balaka added that she was supposed to go there in the future too, as were her brothers. Balaka said that it was commonplace. He wanted to say something else. Keith looked at him. Aristella was sitting in the library reading. Balaka said she led her and pulled out the records of the victories and defeats of the first squad. The teacher paused. Suzu and Ria concluded that this was the source of the magical energy. Keith replied that it was clear to him. Having carried out Prince Alan's orders to eliminate the wyverns, the whale arrived at the capital to report back. Alan was pleased that the hero had been able to help him out by dealing with the wyverns the other day. The whale replied that he had no problems with them. But the hero speculated that the order wasn't always short of humans, and Alan could agree with his guess. For that matter, it could be said that the 11th Knight's troop had offered to increase the number of soldiers and supplies. Although the hero had left the Knight Order a month ago, there was no change in the situation at the moment. And that wasn't good, but it wasn't bad either. Keith assumed that they were up to something, but Alan couldn't answer him that question. There was a lot he didn't know. But that would be like asking a whale who was far from the front to defeat the demons. It made sense that there were no supplies or troops that could be provided to the 11th squad. They didn't have to act right now. After remaining silent for a bit, the boy nodded his head and said he understood. Alan noticed something strange in the expression on the whale's face. He questioned the whale and asked if he really felt responsible for them. Keith immediately replied that that wasn't true at all. Besides, he already had something worth doing. Alan said that he wouldn't have been able to stop Captain Venua's dictatorship while he was there anyway. The guy remembered that the investigation report was ready, and the whale thanked Alan for his promptness. Handing over the documents, Alan said that if he wanted to thank him, he should have expressed it to his subordinates. The hero asked that he not be used everywhere and anywhere in their research. He was a sage after all, and he supposedly had an advisor. After all, it didn't make any difference, and for good reason. Alan spread his hands and said that if the hero had his reasons, he wasn't interested. But judging from the report, Alan was satisfied that the whale was doing a good job of being a model teacher. Taking the report, the whale looked at Alan and asked him not to joke around like that. Alan replied that he had no more visitors today, so the hero could stay here and watch as long as he needed to. A few days ago, the whale had asked Alan to gather information on the losses of the First Order of Knights. In the battle records that could be viewed at the Academy, the killed and wounded were shown as numbers.as for the details. It was a separate document in the form of an injury report. But unlike the common battle report, the injury report could only be viewed in certain places. As expected of Alan, the result was worth it. He had gathered the information well, but the report contained all the details of military operations, injuries, and cause of death. The hero scrutinized the papers, trying to find the information he needed. He knew there had to be information here that he needed. But in the middle of the night, the boy woke up to something warm and soft pressing against his chest. While reading, the guy noticed one interesting entry. It was a report on the severed hand of Eleanor Granless. The name seemed quite familiar to the whale. It was the name of Aristella's sister, who was 7 years older than her. The students thought that taking the first lesson after practicing was too cruel. The hero replied that it wasn't, or else using the grounds for practice would upset the balance between classes. Bellamy said he asked around to others, but they were the only ones who had such a hard practice. Usually at times like this, those in first-year training would use magic to a purpose. Even during the practice fights, they weren't so brutal without a trivial grading system. Bellamy thought their teacher was right. Graham, meanwhile, was worried that the 5 people who ended up in the medical room wouldn't make it to class today. Fairy asked her friend Aristella for her opinion. Fairy noticed that something was wrong with Aristella and took her hand. The worried friend asked the girl what was wrong. The hero noticed it too, but didn't say anything to them. Aristella smiled and said she was thinking about what was important for the tournament. Suddenly, Aristella was called out by the hero, and the girl stopped. Keith thought they needed to have a word, so surely she had to remember how to get to his lab. Aristella replied that of course she remembered the way. The girl looked at her friend and thought that they would definitely not talk here. Aristella replied that it was no big deal and promised to come over after class. Keith replied that he would go check on the others' well-being in the medical room. They, on the other hand, were to get changed and head back to class. After the admonition, the teacher went on his way. A disgruntled accomplice met the hero in the medical room and told him that 5 students had already been hospitalized today. But the whale replied that the number of injured had been cut in half compared to last week. The nurse sarcastically replied that was just fine. The whale replied that it was sarcasm, but the girl knew it perfectly well without it. Acris was concerned that compared to last week, the wounds were more serious. The teacher hoped that everything would be all right. Like last week, there were not many students who opted for the second hour of practice. Keith planned to make the second hour of practice as a lesson to review the material if possible. If the students didn't choose it, the teacher felt he wouldn't have any more questions. Acris looked thoughtfully at the hero. But in the end, despite that, they still ended up with all the hospital beds occupied. After being quiet for a bit, the hero considered what he could say to Acris. He asked the girl to listen to him. Keith was sure that it was temporary, but Acris didn't understand why he was so sure of it. The guy replied that for those who wanted to become stronger for a greater purpose, he had a way to increase their power. However, if that way would be dangerous, then it probably shouldn't be given to his students. Acris pondered his words and said that he was right. Until they knew the extent of the danger, the hero could only say that it depended on the circumstances. But the whale had always said that it would depend on what the man himself wanted. The boy thanked the Acris and said that in this case he had made up his mind. The girl somehow got the feeling that she had become involved in something terrible. The boy smiled and asked her not to think about it, because she was already his accomplice from the very beginning. Acris didn't even realize she'd been his accomplice from the start. But if anything, the hero always wanted to count on her. Acris grinned and said that the whale, as before, was not a role model at all. But compared to the past, the negative angles had been smoothed out, she realized. Still, he was far from perfect. Whale remembered that there was something he had not told Acris. He had forgotten to ask the girl what she remembered about Eleanor Granleys. The hero wondered what kind of person she was, and she said that Eleanor was very beautiful and had a gentle disposition. In terms of impression, she seemed softer than Aristella, but she said she would become a knight and help the people. She maintained her image as a noble noblewoman. The boy was roughly beginning to get a sense of what she was. After all, these sisters were the only ones who didn't have a big difference in their characters, and they weren't that far apart. The hero thought that Eleanor would make a great target for Aristella, who was so much like her sister. Acris began to guess everything and said that apparently she was right. She realized that their conversation had something to do with Aristella. Without hiding it, the hero said that she was right. Her willingness, choosing to take the thorny path, and even knowing it was dangerous, the whale might have been all it could do to push her away. Acris was somehow surprised to see a slight smirk on the whale's face. The boy had read that no one could obstruct a person with a strong will. That was roughly what the whale had always done. Since the hero had already checked the condition of the students, he needed to get back to class. Before he left, he turned to Acres and forgot to tell her something else. Keith wanted to assign her to take care of the students as their nurse. Rhea jumped forward and Suzu stepped back to prepare the next attack. Later, when the teacher came to his office, Aristella warned him of her visit. In that case, the whale asked her to come inside. The fireball was not only gaining in power, but also in size, and soon became 10 times larger. Aristella asked the teacher what he wanted to talk to her about. The guy replied that he wanted to talk about her weakness that he had noticed at practice. Apparently, the girl was interested in this conversation. Compared to the other students, she had outstanding abilities, but still something about her stood out. The hero decided to ask Aristella directly about her fears. It seemed to him that the girl was very afraid of something. The girl was a little confused when the teacher asked Aristella what she was so afraid of. The agitated girl exclaimed that she was not afraid of anything at all. She thought that the teacher was thus insulting the Grand Lys, who had become fearless. Keith replied that he did not mean that at all. That the Grand Lys family was famous for its fearlessness had nothing to do with Aristella. The girl ignored his words and exclaimed that she was one of the Grand Lys family. There was again an awkward pause between them. In that case, the hero asked her about her command at today's training session. Keith huffed that she had been doing perfectly as long as the goal was to weaken her opponent. But starting from here, instead of deciding to press on, she was able to make a decision that caused the battle to drag on and her opponents to turn things around after regaining their strength. Even though they ended up winning in the end, it depended on their individual abilities. Aristella nervously clutched the piece of fabric on her skirt. If she was alone, she would be fearless, but when she started leading a team, she would become timid and unable to do anything. The hero had no doubt that Aristella was afraid of this, and asked her the question directly. Keith believed that in this way someone through her fault would end up getting hurt. That time in training, when the whale had captured her with magic, she had said that if faced with that choice, she would choose death. On the table lay an open book with information about the 5-pointed star. Lewis asked the princess what she thought would happen if the royal seal simply disappeared. Her very choice of death characterized her from a very different perspective. Even though she had chosen death, it meant that by doing so, she wanted to escape from it. The reason why she was afraid for sure was because of her older sister's great trauma. Aristella didn't understand how her teacher knew about it. Urias said that she had been born into royalty, and she had a royal seal that no one could follow. She believed that God had given it to her for a reason. If she had a story to tell, it was better to spill it out here and then relax. Aristella pondered his words for a moment, before sadly lowering her head and covering her eyes. After a few seconds, the girl pulled herself together and raised her head again. The girl began by saying that her sister Eleanor was special to her. As her youngest sister, she loved her more than anyone else, which was why she had always been fidgeting around her since long ago at home. Eleanor was the very ideal that Aristella longed for. She aspired to be gentle, noble, and beautiful. It was for this reason that Aristella was speechless when she saw her with her hand cut off. The girl was silent for a while, but the teacher did not interrupt her and gave her time. Aristella admitted that the trauma itself was a shock to her, but what struck her most was how her sister had changed. Rune, Lewis, and Marina headed into the forest. The weather outside was perfect, and the sun was shining brightly. Aristella realized that there was nothing she could do about it on her own. She could do nothing about the demons or the battle. But the herb actually turned out to be poisonous. But still Aristella couldn't accept something. At these words it became so hard for her that she fell silent. But the whale was patient and understood everything, so he kept silent and waited for her answer. The girl could not accept that her father was a captain of the First Order of Knights and thought of his daughter, who had been so seriously injured. As an outsider, he was sad, but as a captain of the order, he was going to put his feelings aside and fight here and now. Aristella didn't want to become like their father. The hero was beginning to realize what this was all about. That was why all she had been doing lately was reading the Injury Act of the First Knight Order. This way, she wanted to find out who made a mistake where, and what result it led to. But looking through the act, she didn't see any erroneous points. But Aristella allowed for the fact that she was inexperienced. But neither the leader, nor her father, nor the other captain made obvious mistakes. Kit could agree that her father was an outstanding individual, so people were a priority to him. Perhaps that was the best choice at the time. In that case, Aristella still didn't understand why things had turned out the way they did. She didn't understand why her older sister had to go through a tragedy, and why she lived with such trauma. Keith replied that it touched on the theme that demons were stronger than humans. He noticed an essence of magic ore, which apparently came from the impact. Lewis rejoiced, for they could make a fortune from it. Rune, in the guise of Cecile, wanted to say something to the Lord. But the boy did not finish listening to Slime and, stroking Marina's head, thanked her. Humanity was quite weak, and the demons were strong. Humans would die even if they continued to choose the right solution. And if that was really the case, they had no salvation. For a while, the whale and Aristella looked at each other in silence. Aristella interrupted their silence and wanted to say something. She wanted to ask her teacher something. She wanted to know if the teacher would have been able to avoid the losses of a few months ago if he had been a captain of the First Order. Keith remembered the losses from a few months ago. There had been a battle where the knights had to retreat under the pressure of a huge number of demons. It was the same place where Eleanor had lost her arm. The hero replied that unfortunately he couldn't do that. He didn't have the talent to lead. In addition, the knowledge of tactics was also nothing more than a subject they had studied for 3 years at the academy. Even if he could save Eleanor, the tragedy wouldn't change if it happened elsewhere. Aristella was greatly saddened that even a teacher wouldn't have been able to prevent it. The girl told the whale that she would not wish to hurt anyone. She admitted that such a wish could be wrong and asked the teacher a question. The boy was silent for a moment and then answered her. It looked like she was wishful thinking. But if that was what she wanted, he would not deny it. Aristella was surprised by this response from her teacher and didn't know what to say to that. The hero told his student that a wish would not come true if one simply wished. It will only come true when she acts. If she is timid, nothing will come of it. Aristella also realized that it was not easy to fulfill her wish. But even if she started to act, she didn't understand how to do the best thing, and she didn't realize what was around her. This all brought one thought to her mind. Even if she had practiced a lot, she could have made a mistake. Also, Aristella's choice might not have been the right one at all. Aristella was afraid of the fact that even one slip-up could hurt someone badly, let alone make a mistake. That was exactly what she was thinking. But the girl realized that thinking that way all the time was foolish. Kit realized that her fears had to do with those around her and those who expected her to be perfect. Aristella wanted to hear from her teacher about her next steps to make her wish come true. The hero nodded his head and said that to begin with, mistakes and missteps happen to everyone. Therefore, he could only tell her one thing. She had to take the first step without fear of making a mistake. Taking the first step might be hard, but otherwise nothing would change. Even if she lost at practice, she wouldn't take someone's life. Now she had to make a lot of mistakes while there was time. And if she followed through, the defeat would turn into a victory for her. The hero believed that at the moment she had nothing to fear. The girl reflected on the fact that she should not have been afraid of mistakes. For a while, the Aristella was silent again. She could not understand the reason why the hero was talking about it so easily. Mysteriously, her indecision began to dissipate, and the whale was glad for her. Whale recalled that earlier, when the girl was lying in the medical room, she had talked about wanting to get stronger. He wondered what she would do to get stronger. He warned her that she had one way, but that she would suffer like hell. Aristella was not frightened at all, and exclaimed that she would do it without hesitation. Keith opened the necklace box and said she would have to use this. The girl looked at the guy questioningly and asked what it was. It was a tool that forcibly transformed magical elements when people transformed it into magical power. As he had said earlier in class, it was inherent in nature that the human body could transform a magical element into some attribute. Hence, to be able to transform multiple attribute magic like this one could learn a new type of transformation. Very rarely, some people forcibly combine the magic of different attributes with another magic power that didn't fit, but since the efficiency factor is at 0, there would be no effect. Kit asked a question and wondered if she remembered about the types of magic powers. As far as the girl knew, there were currently 4 types of magic power: fire called Ignis, air Animo, water Aqua, and earth Som. Kit smiled slightly and replied that she was right. She had been good at wind magic since birth, but after a few years she managed to master water. As the hero realized, she had mastered 2 magical attributes when she entered the academy. Aristella was even becoming uncomfortable with how quickly the hero realized this. The guy replied that he was their teacher after all. In other words, in her case, she could transform a power into anima. This meant that it became possible to transform the aqua as well. Since the prevailing magic and the body were related, if one element was changed artificially, there would naturally be different harmful effects on the body. It was believed that this tool would cause so many harmful effects to a person unless she was a dual attribute carrier or more like Aristella. Aristella listened to the teacher in silence. She was clearly interested in learning more about this tool. Though unconsciously, if she had the ability to convert 2 elements into magical power, then there was no point in forcing the other elements on her. The higher the reward, the more dangerous the errand, so the limited eligibility of only high-level adventurers was quite reasonable. Also, there's an Orichalcum-ranked adventurer in Norn's group, and in theory, they should have finished by now. As far as she was concerned, this tool was dangerous, and she was right. Keith also replied that the risk was certainly balanced by the payoff. If the body could be adapted to transition to Ignis, she would be the rarest of the 3 types from now on. Aristella couldn't believe her ears. Possession of 3 types was quite rare, said to be possessed by at least 1 member in knightly orders, and all of them definitely possessed supreme abilities. Aristella wondered how to become like them. She had never heard of such a method before. She had heard that the only way to possess the 3 elements was through constant effort by those who had exceptional talent for it. In truth, that statement was rather one-sided. Keith asked Aristella not to think that there was only one way up. The girl rolled her eyes and replied that he was starting his sophistry again. Keith replied that it was up to her whether it was true or not. But if she couldn't handle the necklace and gave in, the barrier and balance of magical power that was damaged could be weaker than it was now. Staying calm and strong meant being in danger. Meanwhile, Castle, Norn, and Ailey were still in search of the Black Shadow. They had already gone around the entire city, but they still couldn't find her. She was 15 years old now, which meant that in 10 years she would be 25 years old. A 25-year-old knight was still considered young. If she mastered 3 types by then, such a speed would be the fastest in history. The current Aristella would graduate from the academy and become a knight, but not yet. Keith didn't think she would live to see that time. The guy wondered what decision she would make and asked Aristella a question. He wanted to make sure that she really wanted to become stronger, even if the risk of ruining her bright future was high. Aristella put her hand on her chest and said she would apply it. Kate was surprised by that answer, but then nodded her head affirmatively. Just as the hero thought, she would have more questions. There were many ways to survive without even using the necklace. That was something Aristella should have known and realized on her own, but here her foolish impatience was showing. The boy looked at the determined girl and thought she had everything upside down. She was in a world where magical battles spread every day and was seriously trying to fulfill that fantastic wish of not hurting anyone. Until now, Aristella was afraid of hurting another, so Keith thought that Aristella would make a sacrifice. And yet, this girl possessed an insanely strong will that never stops even if she didn't realize the goal. Keith smiled slightly and thought that she was a lot like them. The hero looked in surprise at Aristella's hand, which slowly reached for the necklace. But Rune managed to stand up for his lord and build a magical barrier. As soon as the necklace touched her neck, Aristella felt extremely sick. The girl screamed and her hands tried with all their might not to tear the necklace off. Aristella couldn't speak, but thought her throat was burning badly. Keith jumped to his feet and realized she was having a rejection attack. The teacher grabbed Aristella's arms and pinned them to the couch. The girl continued to scream in pain, but Keith remained perfectly calm. Suddenly, the huge maw of the beast appeared in front of the adventurer's face. Aristella tried to comply with her teacher's request and breathed calmly. That was exactly what Keith was trying to accomplish. She had to concentrate on exhaling and follow her shallow breathing. After a few minutes, Aristella finally began to calm down and the room became quiet. The hero held her hands until the last moment, just in case. Keith noticed that Aristella's body began to tremble, but she still calmed down. After that, Aristella turned to the teacher. Her face expressed awkwardness and shyness. She lowered her gaze and replied that everything was fine now. Only then Keith let her go and replied that it was fine. The hero warned that the fever and fatigue would persist for some time, so she had to be extremely careful in her daily activities. Her concentration would be reduced, so she had to be especially careful about accidents and injuries right now. Aristella replied to the teacher, saying that she understood that. Aristella looked away from the teacher and fixed her lock of hair. Still, she thought Keith was very strong. The boy didn't understand her words and asked again, but the confused Aristella remained silent. Kit replied that, despite being banished from the order, he had been a knight until recently, and would certainly not have been inferior in strength to his apprentices. The girl felt embarrassed, for that was not what she had meant at all. Aristella fixed her hair and replied that it had rolled off her tongue, so she asked her to forget about it. Aristella didn't know what she was talking about. Before she left, she turned to the teacher one more time. She asked how long she would have to wear the instrument. Keith thought that was a question she should have asked before she even put on that necklace. But to be honest, he didn't know the answer to that question. Even though it was a finished product, there were no examples of it being used. Theoretically, there are big differences for each wearer. It could take a few days, months, or more. Aristella touched the necklace in surprise, thinking that it could have taken that long. In any case, no one had ever taken it off midwear yet, as that would have a negative effect on the person. The girl thought about the fact that as she was bringing it for a month, the worst tournament was only to be wished for. The wolves were confused by so many arrows and couldn't dodge them. A few monsters still managed to avoid the attack. She decided that if something went wrong, all she had to do was fix the problem before the tournament. Aristella understood the teacher and smiled at him. She was confident that she would go through this torturous hell-like path and it would not be in vain. In that case, Keith said that if she showed results, he would not say a word of reproach to her. The girl thought that this was the end of their conversation, and Keith bid her go to bed. Aristella apologized, after which she left the study. Left alone in the room, the hero went to the empty box and silently closed it. The hero knew that the time of Aristella, similar to a trek through hell for her, is just beginning. The next day, the girl kept thinking about the necklace given to her by her teacher. Looking in the mirror, Aristella realized that it was unnoticeable to the eye, but inside she felt as if something was raging inside her. The girls asked Aristella if she was going to the academy. The girl didn't even notice that quite a lot of time had already passed and apologized, saying that she would be right there. During the lesson, the teacher turned to Aristella and invited her to come out and explain the question. But she did not hear the teacher and continued to make notes in her notebook. There was silence in the class, and everyone looked at the girl, who continued to be in her own thoughts. The teacher once again called the student, and Aristella jumped up from her chair. The teacher asked Aristella what was wrong. It was quite unusual for her to have Aristella fall out of reality, but if she wasn't feeling well, it was best to go to the nurse's station. Aristella was surprised that she hadn't noticed the teacher's address at all. She replied that she was fine and apologized. Raoul thought her classmate's behavior was rather odd. This was the first time the hero had heard of acceleration magic and assumed it was the one Rhea used when moving. It was easy to imagine. He just needed to imbue his body with mana, thus strengthening and speeding it up. The hero agreed and offered to try it. But suddenly a rather strange feeling came over the girl. For whatever reason, she couldn't apply this solution to the question, which seemed strange to her. Aristella had no doubt that she knew the solution, but for some reason she couldn't think at all. The teacher looked at Aristella with astonishment as she slowly began to write on the blackboard. The whole class kept their eyes on the student who, for some unknown reason, wrote for too long and then silently put the chalk back on the board. Even though she answered correctly, she took too much time to solve it. The teacher knew that Aristella should have answered the question without thinking. The student apologized to the teacher. The woman replied that her answer was correct and she had nothing to apologize for. She asked the girl to take her seat, and Aristella headed towards her desk. Taking a couple of steps forward, Aristella noticed that her feet were starting to get tangled. Her foot got caught on the other one, and then the girl fell down in front of the whole class. The teacher looked worriedly at Aristella, who jumped to her feet abruptly. The woman hoped that Aristella was all right and suggested that she go to the medical room. The girl thanked Mary's teacher for her concern, but she would do that when she was completely sick, but for now, Aristella wanted to be in their class. Aristella slowly sat down at her desk and thought that she had been in this state since last night, and it was as if her body wasn't listening to her. The guys were concerned about her condition and started questioning their classmate. Rhea fearfully flew up to the hero and asked if he was all right. Keith smiled and replied that he was safe and sound. Now that she mentioned it, the guy wanted to know why he was still in one piece. He assumed it was because of his clothes. Aristella noticed that she couldn't even pick up her pen properly. She tried to feel the distance, put her hand up to it, and take it, but it was hard for Aristella to perform even that simple action. Perhaps Teacher Whale was talking about just that when he warned her that she would have to go through hell. What used to be natural was suddenly impossible for her. It was quite hard for her to not be able to use her body normally. A person's body magic were completely connected to each other. If the body wasn't okay, the magic was also affected. The reverse was also true. If the balance of magical power was lost, for example by using too much magic, it would negatively affect the person's physical state. In this case, the magical power, different from that which is originally familiar to this body, when artificially introduced filling the body will feel alien, and will also cause a lot of problems. All this the hero decided to tell the actress, who kept nodding her head affirmatively. The girl put aside the documents and replied that she understood all this perfectly well. But she didn't understand why she had to tell her all this. Besides, she was busy right now. The hero figured she might as well hurry up to the office, too. He just thought it was worth sharing the information with his only accomplice. Acres continued scribbling on the paper, trying not to think about the fact that she was his accomplice. The hero wanted to warn that Aristella might have come here feeling ill, but it wasn't worth worrying about. The main thing was to keep her necklace on. Still, Acres didn't understand when she had become his accomplice. Keith seemed to like people like that, and she always talked about how she wanted to help with the klutz. Of course she did, and Acres liked Aristella. The girl thought it was amazing that the hero remembered all the things she had said to him and assumed it was a show of sympathy. The boy shook his head negatively and replied that it was definitely not. Acres puffed up her cheeks unhappily. Still, something seemed strange to Acres. For whatever reason, the whale was intensely interested in Aristella. The hero thought there was nothing special about it, but Acres knew that he had made this necklace especially for her. Keith replied that it had already been designed by him earlier, so it didn't take long. Still, Acres thought that the hero liked to bend to others and asked Whale a question. It seemed to the girl that the whale had changed a lot since arriving at the academy, but the hero didn't understand what she was talking about. He didn't think it was possible. But Acres insisted that he had definitely changed. She thought the whale had gotten softer, but to him it sounded like something impossible. Acres said that things weren't as rosy as he thought, for he was still terribly inattentive to others. The boy grinned and agreed with her words. Even though the whale had no seniority, he remained just as brash. The guy replied that the same was true for Acres herself. The hero got to his feet and said he was done. He apologized for distracting her and decided to leave. It already seemed strange to Acres that the hero was suddenly so polite. Keith waved goodbye and said that he didn't always allow himself to kick a bulk. Acres smiled at him, and the whale left. The girl was glad that he wasn't completely kind yet, but she didn't understand why she was even so happy about it. After her training at the academy, Aristella went to her room and thought that this week had really been a hell of a week. She was slowly learning what she could and couldn't do. In fact, she wasn't capable of anything yet, and her magic was too complicated for her. But the girl believed that as she was prepared to prepare her mind and body beforehand, everything would go smoothly. The sensation wouldn't go anywhere, but it would go more gently and smoothly that way. But still, Aristella was worried that she wouldn't be able to advance in training next week. She was sure that she was the weakest in their class right now. Each of the students proved to be strong enough to be accepted into the Royal Knight Academy. Each of the students were strong enough to be accepted into the Royal Knight Academy. Even if their abilities differed greatly, there wasn't much difference in skill levels and practice. The hero was in shock and didn't understand what was going on, but the first thing he wanted to see was Esther and Elsa. Zink was taken to a small shelter where his family was sitting. They were all good at what she was incapable of. Aristella thought that if she faced an opponent, she would have to use everything she was capable of, but she wasn't sure what she could do in that case at all. She doubted that she could compete at all with these students, who even in her best times would have been serious rivals. The answer would have been unequivocally negative. As circumstances changed, so did the plan of action. Then the best option for her now remained alone. With the beginning of the week came the practice sessions on the training ground. The hero took the list in his hands and asked for those he would name to gather first. Fairy smiled and said that as always their teacher had biased everyone into teams. Celica found herself in a group with Fairy and Lena again. Lena noticed that this time, they still had Aristella and Edge with them. In the end, Will told everything that had happened before, and about his banishment from for those two. Now he had to condemn them. Aristella thought about how these guys were very good, but not the best. They had a high win rate. Edge was a mediocre student in all subjects. He was a student with no weaknesses or strengths. With this lineup, they were unlikely to be able to deal with strong opponents. Normally, she would have been able to use her swordsmanship skills, but her form left much to be desired. Aristella didn't understand what their teacher had in mind by splitting them up like this. She was sure it was done for a reason. Aristella could only guess what he expected from their team. Graham suggested they start their match and came forward to be the commentator along with the Bellamys. Bellamy thought that Graham was too loud. In the first round, a team led by Raoul and Team Humor would battle in the first round. Graham commented on their fight and explained that they were actively attacking. From the beginning, they had a pretty intense fight. Bellamy had heard that their families had been rivals for a long time. Based on that, Graham understood why they were fighting like that from the beginning. Graham waved the guys off and told them they would be back after the commercial. At that moment, a teacher came up to them and hit Graham on the head. After that, the whale looked silently at Aristella, who was watching the first fight intently. It seemed interesting to the hero that they knew everything about each other, but still couldn't defeat each other. Aristella heard his words and looked questioningly at the teacher. She replied that that was exactly why they couldn't win. They read each other's every move. Keith asked his student Aristella how she was feeling. The girl replied that the worst was over. She already guessed that the teacher knew the consequences, but nevertheless decided to keep silent. The boy replied that the experience of dealing with such unexpected problems on her own was invaluable. Aristella was not satisfied with his answer and thought he could have said it better. Keith said that their opponents would be Kane's team. The girl had already guessed this and told her teacher about it. Keith found it surprising that she could guess. But considering the makeup of her team, their only weakness was an opponent who would go for broke. She was sure that was exactly the kind of opponent he would put against them. Kane had a rather large build, and was also a head taller than any other guy. His physical attributes were best in class, and his strength and speed was high even by the standards of knights. But Kane was not good with elemental magic, but he was excellent at enhancing his physical abilities. In battle, he would try to immediately strengthen himself and strengthen his body. Kate was impressed that she was able to find out so much. It could be said that they had a good chance of winning, but Aristella shouldn't relax. Aristella sighed heavily and said that she had guessed it herself. They watched the boys fight in silence, and the whale noticed that Aristella was acting differently today. It was as if she were trying to see into the distant future. The whale didn't notice how long he looked into her eyes. The girl thought something was wrong with her and asked a question, but the whale replied that everything was all right. He thought it was strange, but she didn't understand what he meant. The necklace should have made her weaker as she lost her skills, but it seemed to the hero that her willpower had not faded and she was not about to give up. Aristella allowed for the fact that her teacher was right. True, at first it was hard for her to accept and just live a normal life, and she was often disappointed in herself. But at some point, she realized something. The guy didn't quite understand her, and Aristella clarified that she understood her feelings. More precisely, they were not her feelings, but those of Eleanor's sister. Keith remained silent and listened to the girl to the end. Eleanor had lost her arm in a battle with a demon. However, she underwent a hard rehabilitation and returned to the front without losing her fighting spirit. To be honest, Aristella didn't even know if that was a good thing, but not being able to do anything else was no reason to give up. Keith already knew what Aristella was like. She didn't want anyone to get hurt but her. It didn't matter so much if Aristella could fulfill that wish. What mattered was that she moved forward. The hero realized that this unreasonable wish could cost her her life. It could be dangerous, but it could also open up many opportunities for her. As her teacher, he had to assist her, but it was a huge responsibility. Meanwhile, the entire battlefield was covered in shards of earth and the thick dust of a serious battle. When it was over, the whale proclaimed the victory of Raoul's team, and the Amir team could not continue the fight. Thus, the next team could enter the field as soon as they were ready. Before entering the battlefield, Aristella called out to her boys. The girl told her group that she had a conversation to have with them. Meanwhile, Kane's team entered the battlefield. Kane kept his eyes on Aristella. He knew full well that everyone but Aristella was not to be feared, but when it came to team fights, they found a way to win. It seemed strange to Kane that the whole group was gathered around Aristella. Last week, Aristella had kind of been feeling ill, and Kane remembered it well. After the girls heard Aristella's plan, Fairy thought she wasn't being serious, but their partner coldly agreed to their plan. Sarika didn't expect that from Aristella and grinned. In principle, Edge was fine with it, as long as the guys were in favor of her plan. Aristella had no doubt that this was how they would surely win. Celica smiled and said that if that was her decision, they would do everything according to her plan. Aristella smiled at her friend and thanked her. Fairy was so excited as if they were up to something bad, but Celica thought it was just good strategy. Their partner had warned them that their opponents would suspect something if they stood there so long. Aristella suggested that they implement this strategy and win. Fairy was enthusiastic and agreed to go forward into battle. The two teams stood opposite each other and prepared for the battle to begin. Graham was impressed with the way the Aristella team lined up in a single row. Kane, on the other hand, put 2 in the vanguard and 2 in the rearguard, with 1 man in the center. It seemed to him that an exciting battle awaited them. Bellamy glanced at the commentator and thought that Graham had perked up. When everyone had assumed their fighting stances, the teacher signaled the start of the battle. At the same time, the Graham exclaimed that their battle had begun. Aristella took up her weapons and ordered the boys to move to the attack. Kane thought they were going head-on and considered who to stop first. His gaze stopped on Aristella, who was about to stab him with her sword. The girl reached her opponent and engaged him in a frontal attack. Kane drew his sword and blocked her direct hit. Kane noticed that Aristella was having a hard time keeping up the pressure, and soon the girl put her sword away. As Aristella jumped back, Kane smirked and realized that she still wasn't feeling well. In that case, he decided to deal with her right now and made a dash in her direction. His partner motioned for Kane to stop, while Aristella ordered the Celica to move on to their plan. Kane had not expected the attack at all. Celica found herself next to the Aristella and attacked Kane with a fire shot. Kane looked at the barrage of fire and realized he was being led into a trap. But as she dodged the fireballs, Kane exclaimed that she wouldn't hit him. Kane called out to his partner Sia and asked for her support, but when he turned back, an unpleasant sight awaited him. He was completely unable to see what was happening behind him. During this time, a cloud of sandy dust had formed behind him, but Kane didn't notice it. Suddenly he realized that the girl's target was him. Celica smirked and said that he had realized it rather late. Now Kane was left alone against 2, but it wasn't that bad. He thought that if he could keep Aristella at bay, things would work out. But suddenly, Kane remembered that there was one more person missing from their team. Kane didn't even notice the edge disappeared from sight. Meanwhile, the guy was already at his back, and had his sword ready to attack. Edge stabbed Cain in the back and ordered him not to look away. Edge smiled and thought that the Cain was done for. Sia, who was teamed up with Cain, called out to her partner, but it was too late. Besides, she realized that she couldn't move properly at the moment. Before she knew it, the girls were surrounding her from all sides, and Aristella exclaimed that she wasn't getting away from them. The girl cursed and exclaimed that she couldn't see them because of the dust. Sia tried to dodge their attacks at the last moment, but the girls were ganging up on her. The guys were confused and didn't know what to do, but one of the guys said that Sia was stronger than Fairy and Lena in sword fights, so they didn't have to worry about her. Celica, who was restricting her movement, was causing more trouble. A member of the enemy team asked the rearguard to support them and rushed to attack. The guy decided to attack the Celica, who was prepared for it beforehand. The girl deftly dodged his sword and exclaimed that he had really come. Her rival had absolutely no idea what she was talking about. Celica thought it was close, and the Aristella was right. The rearguard asked Klaus to be more careful. Their partner didn't have time to use defense magic and was getting very worried. Celica used a fire shot on Klaus, and the guy stopped. He covered his face with his hand to stop the dust from getting into his eyes. No sooner had Klaus opened his eyes than he saw Edge and Aristella in front of him. The guys swung their swords in a leap and were ready to give him a decisive blow. This surprised Klaus so much that he had no choice but to watch them. Aristella and Edge deftly dealt with Klaus and gave him 2 decisive blows from both sides. Their assistant exclaimed that Klaus had lost and didn't know what they should do. Her partner offered to reinforce him and Sia. The girl explained that she could reinforce 2 at once, but such reinforcement would not last long. But the guy thought it would be enough, as Sia wouldn't need much time to deal with Lena and the others. Aristella suspected that it was likely that one of the rearguard would go into battle now, and suggested to the Edge that they attack them first. The girl meanwhile reinforced her comrades in the rearguard. Aristella ordered action now and asked Celica to lift the veil over their rearguard. Celica understood and used fire projectiles to veil the enemies. In the end, Cain's team was defeated. Bellamy and Graham were shocked at this unforeseen result. The girl calmly put her sword back into its scabbard. Churchill had peeled his apples, but now Slad couldn't get up. Everyone was shocked that Aristella won, and the fight took less than a minute. Some thought that they won because of Celica's magic, but someone else thought it was because Edge was able to beat Cain. One of the guys reminded that it was Aristella who came up with the plan. Graham asked Bellamy to comment on this fight and say something about their strategy. Bellamy believed that Aristella and her team pressed in numbers one at a time. They divided the opponents and did not allow them to come together. He was most interested in what had happened while he was asleep, as well as why he was here and where the hero was now. The teacher asked the next team to get ready and also take the injured to the infirmary. He glanced at the Aristella that had gathered a few swords and was walking towards him. Keith had to admit he was surprised at how she was able to completely read Cain's tactics. Aristella thought it was no big deal. After all, that was all she was capable of right now. She should have found a path leading to victory. That was all she could and should do. The girl didn't want to admit it, but somewhere in the back of her mind, she was too proud of it. She always had a lot of options in front of her, so it was hard to make the right choice. Besides, she had hardly ever been defeated, and so she had no material to think about. Aristella replied that the teacher was the first to give her the opportunity. The hero laughed and assumed that he had become her spiritual mentor, but the girl replied that it was not so. She admitted that she was still a little upset about that day. Keith clarified that she was indeed upset. She smiled and replied that she was only a little upset. One morning in the teacher's lounge, there was a conversation between two teachers about the whale having a day of joint lecture classes. The woman had already forgotten about it. She smiled and remembered that it was indeed true. This time, the whale teacher would be giving the lecture. The man heard that he had been blessed by Mrs. Mary. The teacher smiled and replied that a lot of students haven't met him yet since he arrived here late. The man laughed and admitted that he was curious to know what kind of person Teacher Whale was and how he taught the class. They wondered what kind of lecture he would give. The teacher assumed that his colleague was familiar with Teacher Whale, and she confirmed this. He was her student and always studied diligently. He was always very strict with himself and also cared for those around him. Such a description made the old man laugh. He was eager to know what the whale could teach the children now that he had become a teacher himself. The woman could only agree with him. In her mind, she thought about the fact that Kit had always been sincere and straightforward, and she was sure he hadn't changed. She hoped that the students would be able to like him. Meanwhile, the students had already gathered in the auditorium. Everyone had settled into their seats and were eagerly awaiting the lecture from the teacher. Fairy smiled at the boys and said that Teacher Whale would be giving the lecture today. Bellamy was sure that most of the students were tense, and it was quite understandable. The fact was that Whale was often referred to as a strict teacher. Fairy frowned and said that was just like him. Aristella called out to the boys and asked them to be quiet. She sternly told her classmates that the lecture was about to begin. In the wide classroom, a whale appeared on the stage. The guy quietly walked to the teacher's desk and looked around at the silent students. The first thing he told the guys was that he would be giving a lecture today, being the teacher of Class 1A. Due to the fact that he had only recently arrived at the academy, he hadn't had time to introduce himself. Keith was keen to point out that up until the end of last month, he had been a knight on the front line. It was time to start the lecture, the topic of which was humanity's battle with demons. Keith took the remote and turned on the huge projection screen. Keith was going to tell the guys about the current state of the Order and its future prospects. It was said that humans were winning the increasingly fierce battles with monsters, but this was not true. If one studied the information of the past 10 years carefully, one could see that the humans were giving up more and more of their lands. This was especially noticeable in the northeast, in the regions of Altera, Zagra, and Hikram. On this map, it could be seen that many villages and towns had actually disappeared. The other teachers were also present at the lecture and listened to him attentively. Keith asked the audience to keep something in mind as well. The Sioris region, which was west of the Magnolia region, fell to the monsters 15 years ago. A tense pause hung in the audience. Everyone was silently but shocked as they stared at the screen where the dragons were depicted. The students' eyes reflected consternation. Fairy smiled nervously and told her friend that it was very much like a whale teacher. No other teacher would have dared to do such a thing. Meanwhile, the teachers looked amongst themselves and giggled quietly. Kit wasn't going to go into the details of each battle, since they knew about them in military history classes, but they had to always keep in mind that humanity was in distress. The hero didn't understand how it happened, but the orc quickly ran towards the Esther and shouted that there was a woman there. In response, the Esther clutched his spear hard in his hands. But he felt that death would not bring them honor, for they would simply die. Whale wanted them to internalize and learn how to survive in this academy. All the students and even the old man opened their mouths after the whale dared to say that. Fairy smiled nervously and told the guys that he had said it after all. Keith was going to show them the battle casualty reports, but those battle documents were hard to get. Serica agreed and replied to Fairy that it was harsh. After the lecture, Fairy repeated the whale's words when he said that many of them would die in battle in a few years. Bellamy threw her hands behind her head and said that she had hit the mark. The girl thought that Teacher Whale wanted to warn not only them, but also the other students of the academy about what the future held for them. He probably did it so that they wouldn't die in battle. There was a small pause between the boys. Aristella repeated another of her teacher's words, and said that death would not bring them honor and they would just die. Aristella thought that the whale was the only person who so openly denied all the teachings of the Night Academy. Judging from the smiles of the boys, they were in agreement with her. Even Bellamy was surprised when the whale said that if word of this got out in the House of Lords, he could have been fired for it. They'd probably say the guy wasn't fit to teach at the academy and scold him for it. But Graham thought the whale was an excellent teacher. Bellamy looked at his friend and said he didn't get the joke at all. Yet the boys surprisingly understood everything. Fairy felt they had to give it their best shot. Aristella looked back at her friends and exclaimed that everything would be fine. There were happy smiles on the boys' faces. Surprisingly, no one was sad after the lecture. After the lecture, the chairman Selina found the whale teacher and explained that he had done a great job. The hero didn't even notice her coming to his lecture. Selina thought it was obligatory, for it was an important day for Keith. Keith felt awkward, for he felt as if Selina had become his mother for a moment. The hero assumed that she had come to him to say something on behalf of the administration and was right. To be honest, she thought he showed the harsh reality of their students too harshly. Some teachers were disturbed by his words. Thanks to him, she was able to see once again what the situation was like at the academy. Being in a high position, it was hard to see what was going on inside. She didn't say it was bad, but perhaps it was dangerous to teach it so early. Selina asked the whale to listen. After all, she had called him to the academy to change this situation. Selina was sure that the students weren't the only ones who had learned something for themselves from this collection. The girl bowed to the whale teacher and thanked him sincerely for the lecture. She smiled at him and told him that the academy was a little better because of him. The whale thought he had done nothing, and Celine grinned back at him. The chairman fixed her curls and said she couldn't wait to hear his results. After this lecture, the boys began to often turn to the teacher whale. The hero advised the boys on how to do their work better. The students offered their options and asked for the teacher's opinion. Once, when the girls came to the whale teacher's office, they were surprised. The teacher had been very busy lately. But the whale told the girls that he had been very busy since he first came here. Sarika noticed that the whale was writing something and asked him a question. The teacher replied that he was making a list of the students and finding out what they were good at and what they weren't. He was also studying their family tree, whether there were any other knights in the family, and then would draw some conclusions. The girls stopped the teacher's explanation and explained that they understood everything. There was too much information for them that gave them a headache. This seemed surprising to them, for previously they had thought that he had a lot of free time. The teacher had been very busy lately. After this lecture, students from other groups often came to consult him, and everyone had already noticed it. Sarika was curious to know what their teacher was working on. Keith replied that it was a secret. Even if he told them, they still wouldn't understand anything yet. The girls frowned at the teacher and fell silent. They assumed they were interrupting him. Keith stared silently at his notes and continued to write something down. If they really thought so, the whale suggested they go back to the dormitory and study. Besides, they did what they wanted and questioned him, after which he gave them an answer. Even though he was right, Sarika spread out on the couch and admitted that she was very comfortable here. Fairy smiled and said that it was also very spacious, and if there was delicious tea here, it would be perfect. Fairy smiled and told Whale that he never said directly that they had to leave. Whale closed another book and said he didn't pay much attention to them. Sarika thought that was cruel and assumed they were nothing to him. But that wasn't what he meant. Fairy grinned and offered to interrupt him a little. Keith wasn't sure they'd really have the courage to do that, and warned that if they touched anything on the table, it would explode. Fairy laughed nervously, and said she would refrain in that case. The girls ended up staying in the whale's room, who continued to do his work. While the girls were chatting, someone knocked on the whale's office. Fairy wondered who was there, and decided to check it out. She assumed that someone had come to consult with the teacher again. Fairy leisurely walked to the door to open it. It was time for Dish's punch. The girl advised him to grit his teeth. He hoped she wasn't going to use her punch. Standing at the door was a sullen-looking student who didn't even smile. Keith knew this girl by the name of Luca Rivet. Fairy looked at the student confused, not knowing what to say to her. At the sight of Luca, the girls darkened. Her incredible blow was an addition to the punishment he deserved. The third-year student introduced herself by her name and said that she came here to talk to Teacher Whale. The guy agreed with her and asked the guys to go back to their dormitory. The girls were not happy about this news, but they left anyway. Luca silently sat down on the couch opposite the hero, and the whale asked her what she wanted to talk to him about. Luca recalled that in the lecture the whale had said that death would not bring honor to a knight, and wanted to know if that was true. Her fist, clenched with tremendous force, pierced space. She was angry when the hero replied that he would never recant them. He smiled and asked Luca what she would do if he refused. Luca exclaimed angrily that in that case, she would force him to give them up by force.